The maid, looking at the lady, said that she was leaving and the lady could rest. The lady breathed a sigh of relief as she knew that today would be the last time she would see the maid. She brought the cup to her mouth with pleasure because she knew that she would say goodbye to everyone tomorrow. But a moment later, she was taken aback as she accidentally burned herself. She knew that if her brother saw her now, he would definitely ask where her dignity was. She understood that tomorrow she would put on her wedding dress and walk down the aisle. She was happy because her story would soon end. Harry Ernst was adopted at the age of 7, after the death of Irina, the Ernst family's beloved daughter. The girls had very similar appearances. For this reason, the Duchess wanted to adopt her. The Duchess, with a gentle smile, asked the girl at their first meeting if she would like to go with them. The Duke and Duchess were the only people who cared about her, but unfortunately, they left this world a year after her adoption, followed by Harry with her first son Eugene. And there was also an attractive second son, Cavell, and the last youngest third son of the Eric family. Unfortunately, the girl washed her face with bloody tears all these years. Even last night, young men burst into her room, which scared her a lot. She understood that if she put on a dress, she would finally be able to leave the house. She was taken aback for a moment, as her wedding dress had been chosen for her by Brother Cavell. She sighed heavily, because she understood that they still loved her in their own way. Harry thought about the fact that she was getting married quite late, because she was already 27. She was considered part of a family that was close to the royal house, but she did not have a drop of aristocratic blood. But her brother still managed to marry her off to a man from a noble family. Her future husband had a good character and a handsome appearance. In any case, she understood that tomorrow she would be freed from the shackles of the house. Finally, she plopped down on the bed, knowing that she would have to say goodbye to the room too. The lady fell asleep with a smile, because she knew that she would have a good dream. But when she opened her eyes, she was taken aback, because she felt a strange feeling. The young man looked at her intently and said anxiously that it was time for her to wake up. She was puzzled, because she did not understand where she knew that she fell asleep in her room. She sighed heavily, as she understood that it was just a dream and she had no need to worry. But a moment later, she heard her brother's voice, persistently asking if she really wanted to die. She turned around and looked at her brother in surprise. The young lady was shocked, because she did not understand when he managed to look so young. Harry asked in surprise if the young man was really her brother's son. He looked at her in surprise and asked what she was saying, because he thought that she had most likely hit her head. Eugene was alarmed, because he knew that she had to go to the stables. He did not understand why she behaved so stupidly. He shouted that she had to pull herself together and come to her senses. He said anxiously that she should get up immediately and go home. She was taken aback for a moment and quietly purred that he was very warm. The young man, in turn, shuddered and looked at her with embarrassment. Harry, in turn, quietly whispered that she was cold. The young man cried out in alarm and called for his sister, as he saw that she was closing her eyes. The first time she met the three devils was around mid-spring. When they first met, she thought they were the angels of the family. Eugene told his parents that they would have welcomed them if they had known they were coming. They looked in surprise at the girl their parents had brought. The young people were surprised and did not understand what was happening. They said that she was some kind of tramp. The Duchess shouted at her son, but he, taken aback, said that he didn't mean that, because she was very thin. Eric, looking at his dog, said that she should calm down because the girl cannot be eaten. The young lady, in turn, shuddered, as she did not expect such a thing. The Duchess said that from now on, the girl would be their younger sister. The Duchess introduced her first son, Eugene. She also introduced her second son, Cavell, with a smile. The moment she saw her third son, Eric, she realized that they were completely innocent angels. The Duchess introduced the young girl to her sons with a smile. She hoped that they would get along well. The young man was excited and shouted at the girl to wake up immediately, as he saw that her hands were icy. He was worried that she might die. The young man looked at his brother and told him to calm down already, because they needed to bring a butler and a doctor. Cavell was taken aback and said that he would do everything. The young man slowly picked up his sister and called his brother. He looked closely at his younger brother and told him to stop hiding and come out. He said that more wood needed to be thrown into the fireplace. Eric quickly rushed to carry out the tasks. A moment later, the young lady opened her eyes and looked intently at her brother. The young man looked at her in surprise and asked if she had come to her senses, but a moment later, she closed her eyes again and fell asleep. Eugene was taken aback and began to shake her, as he knew that she could not lose consciousness now. The young lady looked at her brother with puzzlement and said that he had hurt her. Eugene sighed heavily and said that the doctor would be here soon. He saw her hands and feet and was worried that she might have frostbite. A moment later, the young lady began to shiver and said she was cold. A moment later, the young man threw a blanket of sheep's wool over her. A few seconds later, she was wrapped in a warm blanket. The young lady sighed heavily as, unfortunately, she could not move. Eric sighed heavily and, puzzled, said that it was all his fault. Hari looked at everyone present intently as she remembered what had happened. She knew that this situation happened about 6 months after she was adopted. Eugene sighed heavily and asked his brother if he understood that they couldn't hide this from their parents. Eugene, looking intently at his brother, said that this time his joke had gone too far. Eric, their late sister's twin brother, despised the young lady more than anyone else. Hari was puzzled because she understood that Eric decided that she had taken the place of his sister. Eugene told his brother to check what the butler and maids were doing. Hari wanted to see what was going on, but unfortunately, she couldn't move. Eugene looked at his mother with excitement and called her. Eugene looked intently at everyone present. The Duchess ran up to the girl with lightning speed and said that everything would be all right now. The Duchess was puzzled. She asked the young lady if she was all right. A moment later, the Duchess looked at her sons with fury and asked what they had been doing while they were gone. The Duke informed his wife that the doctor was already on his way. The Duchess was furious, as they had been gone for too long. The Duke looked closely at the young girl and said that he would now carry her to bed. A moment later, he looked menacingly at his son and called him. He asked where his brothers were. The young man said that he had told his brothers to check the butler and the maids. The Duke told his son that he would tell him later what had happened. The young man froze for a moment and asked for forgiveness. The Duke looked at the girl with his gentle smile and said that she would be much more comfortable in bed than on the hard floor. The young lady looked intently at the Duke and called him. She looked at him intently and called out quietly, but a few seconds later, she said he had screwed her over. The Duke froze in shock when he saw that the young lady had simply fallen asleep. He looked at her intently and in surprise and called out, but it was all in vain. A whole month had passed since the young lady woke up. She was puzzled and did not understand why she came back. In turn, she guessed about her brother's plans and ran out into the street, slipped, and eventually lost consciousness. She knew that the brothers protected each other to the last, and since she had already been through this, she did not feel resentment. The Duchess who looked after her became weak and was now looked after by the Duke. She realized that he was a very kind father, except for the time when he was raising his sons. The Duke looked at her with a smile and said that she should eat well. Looking at the Duke, she said that it was better not to eat before the wedding, as you might not fit into your dress. The Duke asked with a smile which of the three she had chosen for the role of groom. The young lady was puzzled, because she was actually going to become a bride. She was in shock because she wanted to get rid of the cursed house as soon as possible. The Duke looked at her intently and said that she must be very tired and could now rest. She thought that she was probably just still sleeping because she was ready for the wedding and her freedom. The young lady sighed heavily and a moment later slapped herself in the face, but after a few seconds, she noticed that it was very painful. It really seemed to her that she had returned to the past. The young man looked at her intently and asked why she hadn't told them anything. He timidly asked why she didn't tell her mother and father the truth. Harry sighed heavily and, looking at the young man, said that she did not remember anything. Harry knew perfectly well that she was lying in the snow when she woke up, so she couldn't know what had happened, and even more so, she had little memory of her childhood. Eric shouted furiously that she shouldn't think she had won, because he had never asked her to cover for him. The young lady sighed heavily, for he was tiring her with his conversation. A moment later, she went and lay down on the bed, and also told him that if he had nothing more to say, he should go away. She sighed heavily, because she knew her wedding dress was very beautiful. Lying in bed, she quietly muttered about her wedding dress, but the young man looked at her in surprise. A moment later, she slapped herself in the face again. Sighing heavily, she said it still hurt. The young man was surprised because he did not understand what she was doing. With the speed of lightning, she fell asleep, hoping that when she opened her eyes, she would return to the day of her wedding. Once again, her wish was in vain. The young man asked his sister if she had gone crazy. The young lady sighed heavily and said that perhaps that was true. He said he didn't care what happened to her as long as she didn't bother him. She sighed heavily and said that in that case, he should have left her there. She asked her brother why he brought her back if it was pointless. He looked at her with surprise and a bit of anger. She sighed heavily, knowing that she could have possibly returned to the future if she had stayed lying in the snow. He said he just didn't want the body of a family member lying around there. The young lady, in turn, slowly crawled to the fireplace, not listening to her brother. He looked at her closely and said that he thought she had gone outside because she wanted to die, but it seemed she still wanted to live. The young lady looked at him in surprise, but did not answer. He asked in bewilderment why she was looking at him so intently. Hari saw her brother's unusual reaction. She knew that he had become boring since the Ernst couple died. The young lady looked at her brother closely and sighed heavily. She knew that it didn't matter how much she looked like his sister. She understood that she still couldn't become her. She sighed heavily as she remembered that she had not eaten normally after her rebirth. She looked at her brother intently and said that he should feed her. He looked at her with fury and asked if she thought about who she was giving orders to. After clearing her throat, she asked if it was because she had gone outside when she already had a cold. She sighed heavily and said that her head was spinning very badly. Looking at him, she called him, but at the same time called him brother. Eugene shuddered in surprise. She looked at him intently and said that she was really hungry, after all. She hadn't eaten since morning. Eugene sighed heavily as he looked at the young lady, but said nothing. After some time, he brought her food. But while eating it, she accidentally burned herself. Hari looked at her brother with a pitiful expression and asked for water, but he said that she should close her mouth. She slowly ate her food while the young man watched her closely. Unfortunately, she was not full, but she knew she shouldn't ask for more. A moment later, she lay down on the bed, knowing she could just have dinner later. The young lady was sad because she wanted very much to go back to her old life, because she could be free there. Eugene looked at his sister in surprise and called her. Cavell burst into the room with lightning speed and wondered if their sister had fallen asleep. The young lady realized that her brother had come to see her and decided to pretend to be asleep. Cavell quickly ran to his sister and started waking her up as he wanted to play tag. Eugene looked at his brother hard and said that he could have read the book better. The boy cried out that books were very boring. Eugene said that he could play with his brother. The young lady, in turn, wondered if they really wanted to play with her. Cavell was a genius swordsman, even in his childhood, and he had the endurance of a monster. Playing with him and the young lady always overtired. She looked at her brother closely, wondering if he was going to force her to play with him despite her condition. Cavell woke up his sister because he wanted to play with her. For a while he shook her, clinging to her clothes. A moment later, the young lady could not bear it any longer and stood up with lightning speed and shouted at him. Cavell looked at the girl with a joyful smile and said that in that case they could play. But a few seconds later, the young lady vomited on her brother. Everyone present was in shock, as they did not expect this, but she knew that they had asked for it themselves. Sometime later, the young man communicated with his father through the magic ball. He said that he was circling next to his sister without leaving his side. The young lady Art looked at her brother as she heard him talking. Eugene looked closely at his sister and told his father that she was sleeping now. The young lady was surprised and did not understand why he was lying about her being asleep if he had just noticed that she had woken up. He looked at her intently and said that she should not get tired until her parents arrived. At the same time, Cavell glanced furtively at the young lady. But after a few seconds, he approached his brother and began to hug him. Looking at his brother, he asked when he could play with his sister. Eugene said that he would have to wait a few days. The young lady was well aware that, as always, Eugene was extremely gentle and kind with his younger brothers. She looked at him intently and called out, addressing him formally. Eugene turned around and looked at her in surprise. Hari asked if they really hated her that much. Eugene looked at her hard and said that they hated her, and they had no reason to love her. He said that she was not their sister. Hari sighed heavily and turned around, saying that she thought so, and also said that she hated them too. He looked at her in surprise and asked what she was saying, but she said firmly that she really hated them. The lady sighed heavily and, closing her eyes, said that she hated them very much and wanted to go back. She understood that if she went back, she would never see them again. She had wrapped them up so much that she wanted to go back. He froze in surprise and looked at her intently. Eugene looked at his parents intently and greeted them. The Duchess immediately asked where Harry was. The Duchess ran towards the young lady with lightning speed. The Duchess asked Harry excitedly if she was okay and if she had a temperature. The Duchess told the girl with a gentle smile that she had transferred her favorite potato soup. She looked at the lady closely and said that she should try to eat a little, even if she didn't want to. Harry looked at the Duchess intently, but said nothing. A moment later, the Duchess began feeding the young lady. The Duchess looked at the girl and asked if she liked it. Harry! With a gentle smile, the Duchess said that she liked everything and also called her mother. In surprise, the Duchess accidentally dropped the spoon on the bed and asked the girl if she could repeat her words. A moment later, the young lady repeated her words, calling the Duchess mother. The Duchess looked at the young lady with tears in her eyes. The Duke froze for a moment and looked intently at the girl. The young people looked at their new sister in bewilderment. She smiled and told her father that she would like to drink some water. He looked at her with a happy smile and said that he would bring everything now. The Duke was amazed and very glad that she called him father. The young lady had never called them mom and dad before, but now everything was different. She looked closely at the young men because she knew that their reaction was worth it. She looked closely at her new brother because she knew that if this was not a dream, she would live differently. She looked at them with fury because she did not want to adjust to them at all. The Duchess looked at the young lady with a joyful smile, for she was beaming with beauty. The Duchess said with a joyful smile that she liked all the outfits her daughter tried on. The young lady looked closely into the mirror and knew that clothes changed a person. Harry told the Duchess with a joyful smile that she liked everything. The Duchess smiled and said that in that case, they would all buy. Harry looked closely at the joyful Duchess. The Duke said with a smile that he had already forgotten the last time he saw his wife's beautiful smile. He thanked his daughter for this. She smiled and said that if her mother was happy, then she was too. The Duke froze in surprise, pleased by her words. The Duke said that if she liked something, she should say so, and they would definitely buy it. She noticed that he was simple-minded. A moment later, she heard her brother shouting that she was not cute at all. Cavell exploded with screams and said that she was not cute. Cavell asked furiously if she really thought she would turn into Arena if she put on the clothes. The Duke was shocked and called his son. The young lady sighed heavily because she understood that everything happened after she called the Duke and Duchess her parents. She looked closely at her father and said that there was nothing wrong with what her brother said because he was telling the truth. The Duke was shocked and told the young lady that this was not true at all. The Duke, with lightning speed, called his son to him and said that his behavior was unacceptable. Cavell looked hard at the young lady and said that he was their father, not hers, and she should not call him that. A moment later, the young lady witnessed a very interesting sight as the Duke dragged his son away, and she did not feel at all sorry for him. The young lady sighed heavily and decided to just go quietly to her room. But before she could take a single step out the door, she tripped over her brother's foot. He shouted that she was irritating and infuriating him. He shouted furiously that she should stop hanging around them and should leave as soon as possible. She looked at him furiously and said that if he hadn't bothered her with his childish antics, they wouldn't have to see each other so often. He looked at her with cold fury and said that she was ugly. The young lady, in turn, did not lag behind and, looking at him, said that he was a dunce. A moment later, the excited Duchess came running to them and asked what was going on. Before the young lady could answer, the young man said that she had tripped and fallen. Eugene looked at her intently and told her that she needed to be careful, and he also offered her his hand. Harry looked closely at the young man, as she saw that he was only pretending to be kind. With a radiant smile, the young lady thanked him, but she in turn knew that he was not the only one who could pretend. The young man flinched in surprise. She was surprised and did not understand why he was reacting like that. A moment later, the young man threw her hand away and it fell to the ground with a crash. Eugene looked at her casually and said that she should have held his hand tighter. He also said that she should eat more, because she was very weak. The young lady of the university, in turn, was furious and shocked, as he said that she herself was to blame for her fall. The Duchess looked closely at her daughter and said that she was worried that the girl was too weak. The Duchess excitedly told her son that she should give medicine to the girl, and after all, it was winter. He smiled and said that it was a very good idea. Harry looked at him with a smile, because she knew that he was not saying such things because he was worried about her health. She understood perfectly well that he, looking at his brother, thought that she was not able to take medication. But in turn, she knew that she was no longer a child, and she should take advantage of this opportunity and take care of her body. The Duchess smiled and said that they could go somewhere when it got a little warmer. Melissa said with a smile that they would do it in this family. The young lady shuddered when she heard such a thing. She sighed heavily and looked closely at her brothers. She saw that they were looking at her with cold fury. The Duchess said with a joyful smile that they would have a very good time. Eugene looked at the young lady with disdain and said that he saw she had learned something. Eugene, looking at the girl, said that he didn't know what their parents saw in her, but it wouldn't work with them. He looked at her with cold fury and said that he would never accept her as family. Eric, as he left, shouted that she should disappear. The young lady sighed heavily after they left, because she knew that they were just children. She knew that compared to the early bullying, this was even sweet. The young lady looked at her room. She didn't want such a pink room, but she couldn't say it. In turn, she knew perfectly well that they had decorated everything especially for her. She sighed heavily, because she knew that Irina's life, unfortunately, was very short. She understood that everyone in the family, including her brothers, loved her very much. Some could not come to terms with the loss after her death and tried to fill the void with her. Others, on the contrary, never forgave her for taking Irina's place. The young lady, in turn, still very much hoped that it was just a dream and that she would soon wake up. A moment later, she turned around and began to cry quietly into her pillow, because she knew that there was no room left in the world for hopes and dreams. The young man looked intently at his dog and shouted that it should attack the girl. Harry sighed heavily and looked closely at the dog. A moment later, the cute dog came closer to her and barked happily. She knew that there were times when she trembled with fear because of the dog, but now she looked at the dog with an innocent smile, because she knew that now everything was different. A moment later, Harry threw her the ball and ordered her to bring it. Eric was shocked. Harry turned around and asked if he didn't feel sorry for the dog that had to endure all his whims alone. The young man sighed heavily, but did not answer her question. A moment later, he shouted to the dog and told it to come to him. He looked at the dog in surprise and asked why she didn't obey him, and also said that he would get angry if she behaved like that. The young lady was shocked because she saw that he punished the dog, but it had done nothing wrong. A moment later, she walked up to the dog and gave her a treat. Penny barked happily. Eric was shocked, did not understand what she was doing with his dog. Harry said with bewilderment that she was giving her treats. He was shocked because he didn't understand who she was to feed his dog. Milady slowly approached the cute dog and stroked it. Harry praised the dog with a smile and stroked it tenderly. A moment later, she looked closely at the dog and told it to give her its paw. Penny quickly obeyed the command. A moment later, the young lady told the dog to play dead, and the dog quickly complied. The young man was in shock and shouted that this was simply impossible. The young lady looked at him with a smirk, as she knew that anything was possible. She understood perfectly well that now she was much better than everyone in the family, because she had been watching the dog for a long time. She was puzzled, because he had no idea how hard she had worked to train Penny. The young man, in turn, froze in shock. He did not understand what was happening at all. Cavell, walking down the hallway, he bumped into them, while he asked Eric and the trash what they were doing. Harry was furious as he insulted her. Eric looked at the lady with a smirk and said that she was bored and that her brother could play with her, while he also called her trash. Cavell asked with a smile if she was bored. Cavell came closer and smiled, saying that he was also bored because he was constantly sitting at home. He said with a smirk that she could come with him and he could train with her, but the young lady was already seething with rage. The young man, smiling, said that today she would be his training partner. Harry asked her brother how old she was. He looked at her in surprise, but said that she was 7 years old. She said that she was younger and weaker than him, and also asked if she could be his training partner. Hari said that, unfortunately, she wouldn't last long, and her brother wouldn't have as much fun with her. She told her brother that a man who enjoys bullying the weak is simply a coward. She sighed heavily and said that only cowards like to do that. She asked if her brother was really that kind of person. Hari asked if it was possible that he had made a mistake and still wanted to train with his brother and not with her. She said that his brother was sad about it and didn't understand how he could be so inconsiderate. Eric froze in shock and surprise, as he did not expect to hear something like this. Cavell looked at the young lady in surprise and asked if this was true. A moment later, he backed away and said that it was all true and he was not a coward at all. He looked closely at the girl and said that he would train with her because he had a brother. A moment later, the young men left and left her alone. She looked after them with a grin as everything happened just as she had planned. Eugene looked at the young lady in surprise and asked what had happened to her because something had changed in her after that incident. He looked closely at the young lady and asked what the real reason was. She didn't understand what he was talking about because she had always been like this. He said that she didn't need to deceive him. She asked how he could claim that she had changed. The young lady looked at him with cold fury and shouted that he did not know her. He sighed heavily and said that it seemed like she was pretending to be a good child to deceive everyone. The young lady froze in shock. She didn't understand how it had come to this. Eugene looked at her with cold fury and said that if she had deceived her mother from the beginning, then he would never forgive her. As he left, he said that she didn't deserve to be here. Some time later, her lady, sitting in the room, suffered from illness. The Duchess avoided her in every possible way. The doctor sighed heavily and said that the young girl's body was weakened after a recent illness. The Duchess looked at the doctor intently and asked if anyone could help her. The doctor said that the girl was fine. She just had a weak body, and most likely she just hadn't gotten used to the new environment yet. He looked at her intently and informed the Duchess that she must take her medication and not go outside. Harry was puzzled and wondered if she couldn't be happy, at least in her dreams. She wondered if this was all a dream, but she was taken aback and told herself that she shouldn't think about it. Melissa worriedly told the young lady that her fever was still not going down. Harry said with a smile that she was fine and that it would be better for the Duchess to rest. The Duchess told the young lady that she would not sleep with her until the cat came, because she would not be able to rest if she left the child alone. The Duke looked closely at the young lady and said that she should have a good rest. The young man looked at the nation in surprise and asked if their sister was ill. Sighing heavily, the Duke said that it was so, and they should leave so as not to disturb her rest. The Duchess looked at the young lady with concern and asked her about everything. Harry said with a gentle smile that she was fine. Melissa kindly told her daughter that if something hurt, she could always tell her. She looked at the young lady intently and said that she must remember that she was her mother. She smiled and said that the Duke was her father, and she must remember that. The young lady, in turn, sighed heavily, as she now felt protected. The Duchess tenderly embraced her daughter and said that she should not worry about anything and should only rest. The Duke smiled and told his daughter that she should eat well. She said that he should eat too, but she called him Duke. He smiled and said that if she called him Dad, he would eat everything. Hari, in turn, did as he wanted with a smile. But in turn, she mocked him, because she knew that he was stupid, because she fed him all the broccoli because she didn't like it. Eugene looked at the young lady intently and said that she must eat it all. He slowly handed her the broccoli. Eugene told his father that if he allowed her to be picky about her food, it would be bad for her health. Eugene said that the girl had a weak body, so she should stick to a balanced diet. Duke told his son that he was right. The Duke looked at her intently and said that she should eat broccoli. The young lady was shocked as her brother was bullying her. She ate the broccoli with tears in her eyes, and the Duke said with a smile that she ate everything very well. A moment later, the young man said with a smile that he had also eaten everything, and the Duke praised him in return. Some time later, the young lady sat quietly in her room and developed her voice. She wondered if all children that age had such a lisping voice. A moment later, she heard a knock on the door. A few seconds later, the Duchess came to her and said that it was time for her to take her medicine. The young lady shuddered, but took the medicine anyway, and the Duchess smiled and praised the girl for drinking it all so easily. A moment later, the Duchess said with a smile that she had bought something in town and that she would give her one candy after each reception. The young lady looked at the candy in surprise. She sighed heavily, as she had not had time to thank the Duchess, because she had left. She knew that she had not been treated like a child for a long time. She knew it would be stupid to eat the candy right now. A moment later, she heard a knock on the door. The young man slowly entered her room. Harry looked at him puzzled and asked why he was here. He said that he came to NEP of his own free will. For this reason, he would stay with her for half an hour and then leave. She looked at her in surprise and asked if it was the Duchess who told him to stay with her. He said with a grin that she was not so stupid. Harry told her brother that he could leave right now and tell everyone that she had fallen asleep. He looked at her coldly and said that his mother had just left and she wouldn't believe it. Now that he had said something like that, she realized that she should have said nothing. A moment later, the young man sat down at the table. She looked at him in surprise and wondered if he really hated talking to her that much. She sighed heavily because she knew that it shouldn't bother her. She wanted to eat the candy in comfort. Eugene winced when he heard her unwrapping the candy, so he asked why she had it. She sighed heavily and said that the Duchess had given her a candy. Eugene looked at her irritably and said that she should give it back. He looked intently at the young lady and, holding out his hand, said that his sister had eaten these sweets. Harry looked at him with a hint of irritation. Eugene said that she must give him the candy. The young lady categorically said that she would not give it to him because it was hers. He looked at her with fury but did not answer. She was surprised and did not understand why she should give away such a small thing. He said that she should give him the candy immediately and not be stubborn, but she didn't want to do it. A moment later, he reached out to her to take the candy. Harry pulled her hand back and asked in surprise what was wrong with him. He shouted that it didn't belong to her and she had to give it back. She was surprised because the Duchess had given her the candy. She was surprised and looked at him because she saw that he was angry. She was surprised because he claimed that she could not take the candies because his sister loved them. A few minutes later, he reached out to her again because he wanted to take the candy, but she did not allow him to do so. The young lady looked at him with a smirk because she knew he couldn't handle her. She dodged him and with a smirk said that he was very slow. Eugene looked at her with fury and asked if she was serious. A moment later, he fell on her. Looking at the young lady, he asked which of them was slow. He looked at the young lady with a smile and said that he had won. But a moment later, he froze in place in embarrassment. The young lady, in turn, was also very embarrassed. She could not utter a word. For some time they lay in this position, in complete silence. A moment later, the Duke entered the room and said that he had heard a noise and asked what had happened. He looked at them closely and said that they were not alike at all, that they were just playing. The lady said that her brother was trying to take the candy that her mother gave her. The Duke asked his son why he had done this. The young man said that he had already eaten it. A moment later, the Duke struck his son in the face with cold fury, and he also said that he now understood from whom his younger brothers had picked up what they had learned. The Duke told his son to apologize to the lady immediately. The young man quietly muttered an apology. The Duke smiled and told the young lady that he would bring her other sweets and would also buy several different kinds at the store tomorrow. The young lady sighed heavily and agreed with him. The Duke sighed heavily and said that it seemed his son had interrupted her rest. He smiled and told the young lady that he would take him with him and she could now rest. The young lady was taken aback after she was left alone because she could not even imagine that the Duke would hit her son right in front of her. The next day, the Duke brought gifts to his family. The young lady looked at them intently. The Duke smiled and told the young lady that if she wanted anything, she could just tell him. She smiled and said that she basically had enough of everything and thanked him. She wondered if all this had happened because of yesterday's conflict. She felt awkward now. To be honest, she was glad that all the brothers were scolded yesterday, but for some reason, instead of joy, she felt sadness. The Duchess looked at her husband with a smile and asked if he had really bought everything. The young people happily boasted to their mother about what their father had bought them. The Duke smiled and told his sons that he would buy them more presents if they were good boys. He looked at them intently and said that they should not quarrel with their sister. The young people said that they understood him. The Duke looked at his children with a joyful smile. The young lady, in turn, thought for a moment. She did not understand why she felt so strange. She wondered if it was her intuition that was playing tricks on her. The Duchess looked at the young lady with a smile. In turn, Hari involuntarily smiled. The Duchess slowly approached the girl and said that she heard that yesterday she had a small quarrel with their brother. She said her son had been through a lot, so she hoped the girl would understand. Hari knew it would be ambiguous to call their conflict a quarrel. She looked at the Duchess with a smile and said that she was fine. And besides, Dad had bought her a lot of sweets. Hari was puzzled because she knew that she was very embarrassed to act like a little child. She sighed heavily as she wanted to drink something strong. The Duchess looked at the young girl in surprise and asked if something was wrong. She sighed heavily and said that she suddenly felt dizzy. The Duke smiled and asked his daughter if she wanted him to sing her a lullaby when they went to her room. The Duchess smiled tenderly and told her husband that he couldn't sing. The young lady, in turn, thought for a moment, as it seemed to her that something was wrong. Some time later, she was having fun with the dog. She happily taught her different commands. The dog obediently fulfilled all her whims. A moment later, the young lady threw the ball to the dog, but accidentally hit her brother. He was puzzled, and she did not feel guilty at all, since it was only her brother in front of her. He was furious and didn't understand why she hit him. Hari said that he should have been more careful and looked around. He asked angrily if she really meant to say that it was his fault. She asked in surprise if he was really crying now. The young man was furious and shouted that he was not crying at all. The young lady slowly reached out to him. He looked at her confusedly, not understanding what she wanted to do. Hari looked at him closely, as she noticed that there was no lump, but his forehead was a little swollen. She looked at him closely and told him to stand still, as she wanted to see how badly he was hurt. The young man was embarrassed and shouted that she should not touch him wherever she wanted. A moment later, she pressed on the spot where the blow had landed. She said that he would feel better if he spit on the bruise. A moment later, Eric approached them and asked in surprise what they were doing. He was puzzled and did not understand why they were clinging to each other. He shouted at his sister, no matter how friendly she pretended to be. A moment later, he noticed his dog and attacked the girl with fury, as he did not understand who had allowed her to play with the dog. He shouted that he was the only one who could play with the dog and the only one who could give her treats. Cavell looked closely at his sister and called out to her. He said with a beaming smile that if she had nothing to do, he could do her the honor of playing with her. Cavell said that there was no need to practice fencing with him, since he had never fought with children like her. He smiled and said they could play tag. She looked at him intently and firmly refused. The young man was taken aback, but she again said that she would not do it. He looked at her in surprise and asked excitedly why she was refusing. Hari said that she was bored playing with him. The young man was shocked because he did not expect to hear something like that. She said that she had much more fun playing with the dog than with him. She asked if his forehead hurt, and was surprised when he said that Tots hurt, because she knew it was a small thing. He smiled and said that thanks to her, everything was already over for him. She smiled and said that she knew it. A moment later, the young man handed her a cookie. He said that he was giving it to her because it irritated him to walk around with it in his pocket. The young lady looked at him with surprise and bewilderment. She sighed heavily, as she understood that he was just a naive simpleton. A moment later, she thanked him with a radiant smile. The young man shuddered in embarrassment. Hari looked at him in surprise and asked what had happened. He asked in surprise why she smiled so suddenly. He shouted that she shouldn't smile in front of him. After his words, he suddenly froze and after a few seconds quickly ran away. The lady froze in bewilderment and wondered if he really thought her smile was creepy. Hubert looked closely at the young lady and said that she got along very well with the young master. He looked at her in surprise and asked if she really wouldn't call him today, Mr. Butler. She smiled and said that she just wanted to grow up quickly, like her older brother. Hubert looked at the young lady with a gentle smile. He slowly walked up to her and gently stroked her head, and also said that there was nothing good about being an adult. He smiled and said that it was better for her to remain a child for as long as possible. A moment later, he left her and asked the servants if they had finished clearing out the food in the pantry. The young lady stood there, confused and surprised, wondering if he was worried about her. The Duchess looked at the young lady closely and said that she must dress warmer, otherwise she might catch a cold again. Melissa looked at the girl with a smile and said that now they could go. The young man shouted to his mother that he had lost his handkerchief. The Duchess looked at her son closely and said that the handkerchief was on the table. She asked if he hadn't found it. Eric sighed heavily and said that, unfortunately, he couldn't find it anywhere. The young lady, in turn, understood perfectly well that he had deliberately hidden it in his closet. The Duchess looked at them intently and asked for a little time, and she would go and look for them herself. She walked slowly into the room, knowing that it was on the table. Eric looked at the young lady with hostility and said that he did not want to go anywhere with her. She looked at him in surprise and asked if it was true, and a moment later said that she wanted to go together. The young man froze in embarrassment and asked what she was talking about. She sighed heavily and said that it didn't matter, and if he really wanted to go, then he should go in another carriage. A moment later, the Duchess came out and looked closely at her children and asked if they were ready to go. She slowly approached the young lady and, taking her hand, said that it was time for him to go. A moment later, they were all walking slowly together towards the carriage. The young lady, in turn, understood perfectly well that the young man must feel for himself what it was like to be a victim. Taking the Duchess by the hand, she looked at her intently and asked if she could sit down with her. The Duchess, with a joyful smile, told the young lady that, of course, she could do it. Eric, in a rage, he shouted that she would not do this, and he would sit next to his mother. The Duchess was shocked. She shouted at her son to stop behaving like this. Eric looked at his mother and said that he would like to sit next to her. The Duchess looked coldly at her son and said that he should behave like an adult in front of his sister. The young man was taken aback, as he did not expect such a thing. He indignantly told his mother that she was not his sister. The Duchess came closer to her son and said that he was a good boy and should obey his mother. The young man stood still for a moment, but said nothing. A moment later, they were slowly approaching the carriage, and the Duchess said that the young lady would sit next to her. The Duchess looked at the girl closely and asked if this was her first trip with them. Hari smiled and said that it was, and she was very happy that she could go out with them all. The Duchess smiled and said that it would be a lot of fun when they got there. The Duchess looked at her son closely and said that he should sit down as he was comfortable. Hari looked at the young man closely, as she could see that he was upset, but she did not answer. The Duke looked at his wife and said that they should look into the pharmacy, and since there was so much around, they could look around. Cavell looked around with a smile and admiration as he saw that there were many people around. The Duke said with a smile that while they were there, they could look into a nice shop. He asked his daughter if she wanted to eat or buy anything. The young lady smiled and said that she didn't want anything at all. She knew perfectly well that it was just a dream, but in turn, she wondered if she could do what she wanted. A moment later, they heard the merchants shouting happily and calling people to come to them. The young lady knew that she was still a little child and could do whatever she wanted. She knew she had to try something tasty eventually. She knew she wanted to try cotton candy every time they went out. She looked closely at the beautiful cotton wool, which looked like a bright sun. She turned around and saw her family. With the speed of lightning, she rushed towards them. She looked intently at her brother and called out to him. She smiled and said that he should open his mouth. The young man looked at her in surprise and asked what she was saying. A moment later, she put a small piece of cotton candy in his mouth. The young man was taken aback, as he did not expect such a thing. She smiled and asked if it was not delicious. The young lady smiled and tore off another piece of cotton candy and said that he liked it very much and that he should have some more. He looked away from her in embarrassment and said that he didn't want to do it. She looked at him in surprise and said that the cotton wool was very tasty and asked if he was sure that he didn't want any more. She understood perfectly well that he was a little boy, but still his expression had been bothering her for quite a long time. A moment later, she approached the merchant and asked for another cotton wool with a smile. With the speed of lightning, she ran to her brother and presented him with the cotton wool. He screamed that he did not want to eat it, but she said that he should eat it now, so that he would not cry about it later. But the young man was very proud. He threw the cotton wool away with lightning speed. The Duchess was excited and asked her son what he had done. Eric shuddered because he did not expect such a reaction. A moment later, he hid behind his brother, as his mother scolded him. He looked at his mother with tears in his eyes. And a moment later, he hugged his older brother tightly, because he was very sad. The young lady looked at her younger brother intently. Sometimes she felt like he was a devil in disguise. Hari understood that it was time to go back. But the boy made her age 10 times faster. But in any case, she looked at him with a sweet smile, because she was glad that everything was resolved. After some time, a man approached the Days and said with a smile that he never thought he would be able to meet them. The Duchess looked closely at her eldest son and said that while his father was busy talking, he should pick up the medicine. The young man said that he would do everything. The Duchess smiled and told her son that he should take his sister with him. Hari was taken aback for a moment and froze in shock, as she did not want to go with him at all. Eugene, looking at his mother, said that he could go himself. The Duchess said that she knew this, but it would be difficult for her to look after all the children at once. She smiled and told her son that he should hold his sister's hand for safety. The Duchess smiled and, looking at the young lady, said that she should not walk around the area alone because it was very dangerous. A few seconds later, the young people went to the pharmacy. The Duchess wished them a good journey with a smile and also told them to be careful. After some time, they were already walking through a crowd of people holding hands. The young lady sighed heavily, as she felt uncomfortable and uneasy. She was puzzled, because since the cotton candy incident, she had not heard a single word from him. He looked at her sideways and called out. Eugene looked closely at the young lady and asked if she really wanted to go back. Hari looked at him in surprise, and a moment later said that she wanted to go back. She understood perfectly well that she would not be able to return back, but she sincerely wished for it, as it would give her the long-awaited freedom. She understood perfectly well that it was not so easy to let go of everything that she had managed to build in the future. A moment later, she was taken aback and froze in surprise. She looked in surprise at the wedding of her elder brother, who went ahead. Moments later, she froze in shock and surprise as she realized she was standing alone. She froze in surprise and wondered if he had abandoned her. Hari looked around carefully, as she saw that there were many people around. Hari knew perfectly well that looking for a lost child in such a crowd was like finding a needle in a haystack. Hari wondered if her brother would have done this to her when she was really a child, or if the trip here had resulted in the timeline taking a different path. She sighed heavily as she saw that this was all her unfamiliar past. She looked closely at the crowd of people walking around carefree. She sighed heavily as she understood that it was all because she was a lost child. She knew it was strange, but she couldn't be mad at her brother for leaving her. She wondered if it was because she still felt like it was all a dream and not reality. A moment later, a lady came up to her and asked if she was waiting for her mother. The lady asked the girl why she didn't wait in the store since it was cold outside. The young lady sighed heavily and, looking intently at the woman, said that she was not expecting anyone. Madame looked at her in surprise but did not answer. Hari knew perfectly well that if she disappeared into the crowd, she could go wherever she wanted. Now that she thought about it, she wondered why she hadn't tried to leave the house earlier. Hari's face sank, knowing that it didn't matter at all right now. But a moment later, she raised her head because she heard someone's footsteps. The young man, breathing heavily, looked intently at the young lady. A moment later, he sighed heavily and said that they had to go. She looked at him closely, as she could see that he was shaking. Hari looked at him with an innocent smile and asked if he had bought everything. Eugene looked at her in surprise. A moment later, with a gentle smile, he said that he had bought everything, and now they needed to go back. She smiled and said that her legs hurt. The young man froze for a moment in surprise. A moment later, he sighed heavily, as he realized what he had to do. Turning his back to her, he said that she could climb on his back. She sighed heavily and said with a smile that he was a fool. A moment later, she climbed onto his back and, grabbing him by the hair, told him that he should go forward. The young man was taken aback, as he did not understand what she was doing at all. She said with a smile that he just had some debris in his hair, and she just shook it out. The young lady asked her brother with a sly grin if it was too heavy for him to carry her, and Eugene said with irritation in his voice that she was talking too much. The Duke looked closely at his son and said that, as the eldest, he had to take care of his brothers and sister when they were not there. He had to be like a father to them. The young man was puzzled, because everyone constantly reminded him of the responsibility he had to bear as the heir to the family. He understood perfectly well that no one could say that he had no freedom, but he loved his family and the duchy more than anything in the world. He understood perfectly well that by protecting them with him, everything would be fine, since his family was everything to him. The young man looked at the young lady with disdain and said that she must rise immediately, as he did not want her to make him feel ashamed. She asked his forgiveness and slowly rose up. He winced when he saw that she had staggered. He looked at her with cold fury and said that his sister was not as stupid as she was. He looked at her with disdain and asked why she didn't act accordingly, since she was just a doll. The young lady, in turn, once again asked him for forgiveness. Eugene looked at her intently, but said nothing. A moment later, he was gone from her with lightning speed, furious, and knowing full well that he would never accept her. Eugene knew he couldn't do this to their dear sister. He saw that the girl had nothing, but then she came and started claiming his sister's place. He was furious and knew he would never accept it. Irina, bursting into tears, screamed at her brother that she was in great pain. The young people looked intently at their sister, who lay quietly in bed. Erich quietly called his brother. He was saddened by the state of his sister. For this reason, bursting into tears, he asked his brother if it was true that their sister had fallen ill because of him. Eugene looked closely at his brother, who was crying with grief, and asked who told him that. He was telling his brother that she was not rooting for him. He asked his brother to never think about such a thing again. The young man was puzzled, because he knew that they were twins, and for this reason he did not understand why he could not be sick instead of her. Eugene sighed, but did not answer. Erich, looking down at the floor and bursting into tears, shouted that he wanted it to be him, not their sister. At the same time, the young lady lay quietly in bed and moaned softly. Some time later, the doctor informed the couple about their daughter's condition. The man sighed heavily and said that, unfortunately, there was nothing they could do. Melissa was saddened by this news because she loved her daughter very much. The Duchess tenderly handed her daughter a small candy and said that the fairies had brought it to her, and if she ate it, all her illness would disappear in an instant. She tenderly handed her daughter with tears in her eyes. Some time later, a miracle happened, and it seemed to everyone that the young lady was getting better. The young people were happy because they understood that their sister was getting better, and they could spend a lot of time with her. But, unfortunately, everything was only temporary, and before she was 6 years old, the fragile little girl left them. The young people burst into tears of grief because they could not let her go. The Duke and Duchess also mourned their daughter with bitter tears. The whole family was in pain to cope with the loss, but they could do nothing but wait for time to ease the pain a little. The young man looked intently at his mother and said that he had heard that she had decided to change his teacher. The Duchess said that it was all true, because she and the Duke had consulted and decided that it would be best. She said that he would start studying next week. He looked at his mother with a smile and nodded in agreement. The Duchess smiled and said that of course they weren't worried, as he always did so well, even on his own. A moment later, the Duchess rose with lightning speed, for she had forgotten something. She smiled and said to her son, "Stop forgetting," that it was time for Erin to take her medicine. The young man froze in shock. The Duchess, smiling, said that she was late and needed to go to the kitchen right now. She looked closely at her son and asked if he could check if his sister was awake. The young man was taken aback and looked at his mother in bewilderment. The Duchess passed her son with lightning speed and hurried into the kitchen. Eugene thought that over time the scars would gradually heal, but unfortunately, he was only thinking about what he wanted. The Duchess looked at her son with a smile and asked if he had gone to see his sister. She wanted to know if the girl was asleep or already awake. As she walked into the room, the Duchess smiled and said that her daughter was a little sleepyhead. A moment later, she quietly approached the door of her daughter's room. Entering the room, she did not see her daughter and asked her son in bewilderment where she could be. Smiling with a gentle smile, the Duchess said that her daughter was probably playing hide-and-seek right now. The young man froze in shock and could not utter a word. The Duchess searched the room with a smile, as she wanted to know if her daughter was hiding behind the curtains. The Duchess looked closely at every corner of the room and asked where her daughter was hiding. Eugene froze in place. He could not do anything and say nothing to his mother. Eric looked at his brother intently and asked if their sister was really there. Eugene froze in place in surprise. He did not know what to do or what to answer. A moment later, he took his brother by the hand and told him that he should follow him. As he stepped out into the hallway, he looked at his brother intently and told him not to think about it, since their sister was not there, and she was not there at all. Eugene looked closely at his brother and said that Mama was a little unwell, and that was the reason she was looking for their sister. Eugene sighed heavily. He didn't know how to explain to his brother what had just happened. After a few seconds, he collected his thoughts and, looking at his brother, told him to forget everything he had just seen. He looked intently at the young man and told him to go to his brother. A moment later, the young man ran in a hurry to his brother. Eugene sighed heavily and glanced sideways into the room. At the same time, the Duchess looked around the room closely. She did not know where her daughter was. Eugene looked at his mother intently. He didn't know what to do or how to behave in such a situation. Some time later, he came to his father and told him everything. The Duke sighed heavily. He said that he understood his son, and now he needed to call a doctor. Looking at his son, the Duke asked him to take care of his younger brothers. Eugene said that he would do everything. His mother's psychological disorder only went away when Hari came into their home. Eugene had no choice but to sit and look at his mother, who was smiling a tender smile. However, the feelings that the girl aroused with her appearance brought discontent not only to him. Cavell shouted with fury that he did not like her, and he did not at all understand why she should be his sister. Eric screamed with the same fury that she was not his sister, and she would never replace his sister. He did not understand why they should live together with her. Eugene knew perfectly well that it was wrong to take out their anger on the helpless child, but he could not control his words and actions. Every time something like this happened, the young lady would quietly ask him for forgiveness. He was furious because he saw that she was alive and well, and had taken the place of his sister, who always suffered pain just by breathing. He was furious and very angry because she had stolen their parents from them. He understood perfectly well that these were just pathetic excuses, but still, he felt similar feelings and thoughts that were drowning out his head. He was puzzled and did not know what to do with such thoughts. The young man looked at the door in surprise and said that it was very strange. The man looked at the young man in surprise, as he did not understand what he was talking about. Eugene was surprised and did not understand why the house was quiet. With lightning speed, he went out into the corridor and called for the butler, but there was silence in response. A moment later, he looked into his brother's room and asked anxiously what was going on. Cavell looked at his brother in bewilderment, as he did not understand what he was talking about. Eugene looked at his brother closely and asked where Eric was. Cavell, without looking up from his game, said that he did not know, and most likely their brother was playing with a dog somewhere. The young man, in turn, was a little alarmed. He saw no servants, not a single person. A moment later, he entered the room and looked at his brother in surprise. He asked him where he was. He had been all this time. Eugene was alarmed that he was alone. The young man sighed heavily and, without looking up, said that he was with his dog. Eugene looked at his brother in surprise and asked where the girl was. Eric sighed heavily and said that he didn't know, and most likely she was in her room. Eugene looked at his brother closely and told him to tell him the whole truth. He wanted to know what his brother had been doing while he was gone. Eric sighed heavily and looked away. After the young man had told his brother Eugene everything, he ran out into the street with lightning speed in search of the young lady. After a long search, he froze in place and breathed heavily. He cried out excitedly as he saw the young lady lying quietly in the snow. He shouted and demanded that she wake up immediately. He was shocked because he knew he never wanted anything like this. He saw the young lady slowly open her eyes and look at him in surprise, calling him brother. The young man froze in place upon hearing this. She looked at him in bewilderment and asked when he had managed to look so young. She looked at him in bewilderment and asked if he was really Brother Eugene's son. He looked at her in surprise and asked what it was saying. He was worried that she might have hit her head. Eugene froze in surprise. Looking at the young lady, he did not understand if she had ever looked at him with such eyes before. The Duke looked closely at his children and said that they had heard that the young lady had slipped outside when she was running away from Eric in fright, and the young men said that this was exactly what had happened. The young man frowned for a moment. Realizing the complexity of the situation, the Duchess was furious. She screamed that even if it was so, the young lady had been outside for so long and was unconscious, she did not understand what her son was doing. Earlier, the young man told his parents about everything that happened. He asked his parents for forgiveness because he did not know, because at that moment he was studying with a teacher. The Duchess looked at her second son with cold fury and asked if he hadn't noticed that something had happened to his sister. The young man was taken aback, not knowing what to answer. She screamed furiously at her son that he only sees his toys in the room. She screamed that in that case they would remove all the toys from his room. The young man was surprised and did not expect to hear such a thing. A moment later, the Duchess approached her son and called him. He shuddered, for he knew that a severe punishment awaited him. She looked at him with fury and asked what kind of cruel prank he had played that made the girl run away out of fear into the street. The Duchess was furious and said that someone could have been seriously hurt. She asked her son if he didn't feel compassion when he saw the state his sister was in. She said that they should all think about us with their bad behavior. She looked closely at her sons and said that she really hoped that something like this would never happen again. The Duke looked at his husband closely and said that she needed to go and rest a little. The Duchess sighed heavily and, agreeing with him, said that she would go and visit the young lady. Eric sighed heavily and looked down at the floor. A moment later, he burst into tears and said that he didn't like having her in our house, and that was the reason everything happened. Eugene understood perfectly well that after this incident, the young lady had changed very much. He didn't know if she was always so radiant. He didn't understand why he was so easily influenced by her. He was surprised and puzzled, because he saw different expressions on the young lady's face. The Duke looked at his son intently and asked for forgiveness. He sighed heavily and told his son that he had been very rude to him. But a moment later, he approached his son and said that he did it because he thought it would be better not to mention the candy to her. The Duke looked at his son closely and said that he seemed to know everything. He was puzzled because he had made him carry a heavy burden. Eugene froze for a moment, but did not answer his father. The Duke tenderly touched his son's face. He looked at his son closely and, sighing heavily, said that he should pretend that he had not seen anything. Eugene looked at his father in surprise and called him. The Duke told his son that his mother had finally begun to come to her senses. For this reason, he must continue to pretend. He told his son that he should pretend that he had never seen or heard anything, and the Duke said that he would, of course, try to prevent anything related to candy in the future. The Duke sighed heavily and told his son that, even if he saw the girl eating candy, he should not say anything. Eugene clenched his fists in rage, but did not answer. He stared after his father. The Duchess visited her son. Entering the room, she called him. A moment later, she sat down next to her son and said that she heard his father scold him yesterday. The Duchess looked at her son with alarm and asked why the Duke had hit him in the face. She slowly reached out to her son and touched his face tenderly. He asked why she had given that candy to the young lady. The Duchess looked at her son in surprise and asked why she shouldn't have done it. The young man shouted to his mother that she had given Harry the drug. Whenever his sister was in pain, the Duchess would always cry bitterly, giving her a candy. He looked at his mother and said that Harry was not Arnie at all. The Duchess looked at her son in bewilderment and said that she, of course, knew about it, and it was just a misunderstanding, since these sweets were completely harmless. He looked at his mother and said that, in that case, she should give him some candy too. The Duchess, with lightning speed, refused his request, saying that only sick children could eat them. Melissa told her son that he shouldn't be jealous of what his sick sister had, and a good brother knows not to take his sister's things. Eugene looked at his mother in surprise and called her. He hoped that his mother would look at them too. The Duchess looked at him with her gentle smile and asked if he wanted anything. He sighed heavily, as he knew very well that he lived every day without knowing what to do. He looked closely at his mother, as he hesitated with the answer. He wondered if he should just pretend that he didn't see anything. He sighed heavily and said that he didn't want anything. Cavell burst into his brother's room with lightning speed and asked what he was doing. But a moment later, Cavell was taken aback and looked in bewilderment at his brother, who was holding the jar of candy in his hands. He looked at him in surprise and asked if these weren't the same candies that their sister always ate. Eugene sighed heavily and said that it was, but now there was no one else to eat them. Eugene looked at his brother closely and asked if he was finished getting ready. A moment later, Eugene told his brother to go down first. The young man smiled and agreed with his brother. Eugene stared after his brother. He was puzzled that he was able to find them after searching everything thoroughly, but he knew very well that he simply couldn't let the young lady eat them. He remembered his father telling him that he should pretend that he didn't know anything, but unfortunately, he couldn't just leave things as they were. Eugene looked closely at the young lady, as he knew that she was probably feeling uncomfortable right now too. In turn, he sighed heavily, did not answer, and continued to walk next to her. A moment later, he quietly asked if she still wanted to go back. The young lady walked in silence for some time, not giving him an answer to the question he asked. But after a while, without looking up, she said that everything was correct and she really wanted to go back. The young man was puzzled. He understood that everything was correct, and this situation was wrong. He understood that if he took her back, then gradually everything would return to normal. He looked closely at the crowd of people, who did not even pay attention to them. Sometime after he let her go, he stood frozen in place and wondered if everything would ever go back to normal. He thought for a moment, because he knew it was all very simple, but in turn, he wondered if it was really so. The lady looked at the young man in surprise and asked excitedly if everything was all right with him. The young man shuddered from the unexpected question. She looked at him closely and said that, unfortunately, he didn't look well. With lightning speed, Eugene turned and walked away, without answering the question posed. He ran in a hurry to nowhere, but after a while he stopped. He was confused and worried, because he didn't know if he had done the right thing or not. After a few seconds, a wave of realization washed over him, and he wondered what he had done. He was frightened and excited, as he remembered the young lady standing quietly alone among the crowd of people. He fell to the ground with a crash and began to cry quietly. He was in shock, because he realized that he was simply the most terrible person. He remembered the young lady telling him that she wanted to go back, and for that reason he tried to justify his actions with her words alone. He understood that most likely she just thought that it was normal to be mistreated, because they saved her from starvation, saved her from the cold. He understood that she thought that she could pay them back in the same way. He was shocked, because these thoughts scared him, but he understood that having justified it, she was not the only one to blame for this situation. He was furious because he knew that they were only trying to protect their sister and her memory, and for that reason, they took out their anger on a young innocent girl, but the girl took it all without saying a word. He understood perfectly well that he, like an ideal son, pretended to be a loving brother, and behaved like an adult always and with everyone. He always helped his brothers, but now he did nothing and just ran away. The lady looked in surprise at the young boy, who was sitting quietly and crying, and called him. She asked excitedly if he was feeling unwell. She wanted to know where his parents were, and she also said that if something happened, she would definitely help him. With the speed of lightning, the young man rose and said hastily that he needed to find his sister. Madame was taken aback and looked after him in surprise, as he rushed off in search with lightning speed. Eugene ran like lightning to the place where he left his sister. He was excited and hoped that she would be there. A moment later, he froze in place when he saw his sister sitting quietly in place. He slowly walked closer to her and said that it was time for them to go. He looked at her closely and froze in surprise, as he saw that she was fine, unlike him. Hari looked at him with a sweet smile and asked if he had bought everything. Looking at the young lady, he knew that she would most likely never forget what happened that day until her death. For the first time in his life, he felt like he could die from such layered emotions. The moment he took her hand, which he then let go of again, he carried the young lady quietly, and after a while, he quietly muttered his apologies to her. In fact, the young lady had been listening to him all this time. The young man's words took her by surprise, and she was unable to utter a word. She realized that he thought she was asleep. As soon as they returned home, he immediately went to his parents' room. The young lady, unfortunately, did not know what had actually happened, but the atmosphere was very tense, and unfortunately, their conversation lasted for a very long time. After this incident, the atmosphere in the family changed a little. The young men treated the young lady to various desserts with a smile. She was surprised and simply confused, because they treated her to different desserts, and she could not choose what she liked. But still, in turn, the young lady accepted every dessert that was served to her. The Duchess smiled and said that the girl seemed to like cheesecakes best. She smiled and said that she liked everything. Hari was surprised and did not understand why they suddenly had a tea party. As far as the young lady could remember, the family members liked to spend time on their own. The boy looked at his mother and said that he would like to taste some strawberries. She smiled and said that she could only allow him one. The Duchess looked closely at the young lady and asked if she would like some strawberries too. Hari glanced sideways at her brother and noticed that he was burning with anger and fury. She looked at him closely and saw that his hostility had diminished a little since he began spending more time with his mother. She was glad about this because she understood that if everything continued like this, then she would not be at all against living like this. The Duke looked at the young lady with a joyful smile and asked if she wanted to change with her father. The young lady was shocked. She wanted to quickly take back all her words because she understood that this was just awful. She hoped that the tea party would soon end and everything would be as before. Some time later, the butler informed the Duchess that a guest had arrived. The young lady knew that the Duchess had begun a course of treatment with the doctor. Melissa looked closely at everyone present and said that it was time for her to go. The Duke said that he would definitely see his wife off. Hari looked closely at the spouses, as she understood that they were hiding something. She understood that she had no good reason to interfere in such matters of adults. She understood that she would have intervened if her illness had somehow influenced their death, which would happen in 6 months. But, unfortunately, they suffered from an accident that no one could have predicted. The young lady became sad and wondered if she could prevent their deaths this time. The Duchess walked slowly up to her daughter and called her with a smile. The Duchess smiled and told the young lady that she no longer needed to take her medicine, and also said that she would like to give her a small gift. Hari, in turn, looked closely at the small candy and wondered if it was a replacement for the one her older brother had carried last time. She looked at the Duchess with a gentle smile and thanked her. The Duchess looked at the young lady with a tender smile and said that she very much hoped that the girl would continue to maintain good relations with her brothers. A moment later, the Duchess handed out one candy to everyone. A few minutes later, she left them together with her husband. The young lady ate the candy with lightning speed because she did not want anyone to take it away from her. The young man looked at his brother with a joyful smile and told him to lend him his toy. Eric looked at his brother with puzzlement and said that he should play with his own. Cavell shouted that he was already tired of his toys. The young lady watched the young men closely, and in the process ate the candy. But a moment later, she felt something crunch in her mouth. The butler looked at the young lady in surprise and asked if something had happened. Eugene approached the young lady with lightning speed and asked if something was wrong. The young lady looked at them in surprise, as she did not want them to come near her. She knew that nothing had happened at all. Eugene looked at her intently and said that she should spit it out. Hari was taken aback and wondered in surprise if he really wanted her to spit right into his hand. He looked at her hard and told her to hurry up and spit it out. The young lady looked at him from under her brows, as she understood that she would do what he wanted. A moment later, she spat her tooth into his hand, and everyone froze in place for a moment. The butler cleared his throat and said that the young lady had lost a baby tooth. He looked at her closely and with a gentle smile said that she should open her mouth for a minute. Hari jumped in surprise. A moment later, she opened her mouth, and everyone saw that she was missing a front tooth. The young man laughed wildly and said that the young lady had a hole in her teeth. Eugene looked at his brother intently and said quite seriously that he had once been like that too. Hari froze in surprise. She did not understand why Eugene was suddenly protecting her. Cavell smiled and said that it was not like that, and he didn't remember anything like that. Hari sighed heavily and looked at her brother intently, as she really wanted to hit him. Eric looked at the young lady with a grin and said that she looked very funny right now. 2 weeks later, the same situation repeated itself, and the young man lost several teeth in front. The young lady, in turn, looked mockingly at her brother and said that she had only one hole, and he had two. The young man was furious, but did not answer. A few days later, the Duchess, looking at her husband, asked if they would invite the Bastier family this hunting season. The young lady froze in place for a moment when she heard the last name. The Duke looked at his wife intently and said that, according to their recent letter, they were going to hunt Silver Forest. The young lady in turn, was alarmed, for she knew that she must marry into this family. The Duke looked closely at his wife and said that he would refuse their request for a visit if she did not want it. The Duchess sighed heavily and said that there was no need to do that, since they had not had any guests for a long time. Hari knew that the Ernst family and the Bastier family were not particularly close before discussing her wedding. Eugene smiled and told his mother that she did not need to worry because he would help. The Duchess smiled and thanked him. The lady was alarmed, as she realized that somehow everything was not as she remembered. The Duchess looked at everyone present and said that the children of the family would also come. The young lady, in turn, understood perfectly well that what would be, would be. The Duchess looked at everyone present and said that the son of the family was the same age as Cavell. The young lady, in turn, was embarrassed when she heard about her future husband being a child. She wanted to see him very much, as a child, because she remembered his radiant smile. When he was an adult, she was very interested to see his appearance and feel his sweet and kind smile. The first time she met him, he introduced himself with a smile and also said that he was very glad to meet them. Johannes looked at the young lady with a gentle smile. She knew that their engagement was already half decided. Then her brother allowed her to make the final decision. The young man smiled and said that today was the first time he was greeting her in person. She smiled and asked if they had seen each other somewhere before. He smiled and said that he had only seen her from afar. He looked at her closely and said that perhaps she didn't know who he was. Hari was very happy when she spent time with him, because she was always relaxed around him. Since he was not very talkative, she noticed that he knew very well how to behave politely and respectfully. And after their next meeting, they decided to get married right away. She sighed heavily, because she knew that she had no lover, and she did not dream of marriage. She just wanted to get married quickly and run away from home. She understood perfectly well that the young man was not just a good man, but the best man for marriage. For this reason, she often wondered why someone like him was not married yet. Then, she constantly wondered why Eugene had found her such a wonderful candidate for a husband. She was very irritated because she knew that her husband was really excellent, but now she was a child again and could not think about marriage. A moment later, she saw the butler and called him. He looked at her in surprise, but she said that she had eaten the biggest cucumber today. She looked at him intently and said with a smile that she even ate the most tasteless broccoli. The butler looked at her closely and praised her with a smile, and also patted her head. The young lady accepted his praise with a gentle smile. The young lady looked at the butler with a smile. She was ashamed of her words, considering how old she was, but she understood that she was just a little child now, so it didn't matter to her. The last time the Duchess and the butler stroked her head, she realized that it felt nice when someone praised her and complimented her. But she sighed heavily, knowing that it would be a little difficult to ask the Ernst couple to do this for her now. Now she was perfectly aware that, ever since she had appeared in this house and taken all their attention to herself, she had traumatized the brothers' childhood. She didn't understand before, but now that she was at a decent age, she saw that they were just children who needed love, attention from their parents, which is why even if they bullied her, she could only get irritated, but not really angry, and she had no intention of taking revenge on them. She knew that when I first got into this situation, all she wanted to do was fight with my brothers. She saw that Eric was not as stubborn as usual. Harry noticed that Cavell listened calmly to what she was telling him. Even Eugene, who had abandoned her, came back and extended his hand to her, and the veil of anger fell from her eyes and her mind became clear. She understood that the couple had probably saved her, but for the brothers it was different. She realized that from their side she was seen as the one who had stolen the love and attention of their parents, which should have been theirs for the next year. Of course, she did not forget all their actions, and as always, unfortunately, she did not have a rash, who to share feelings with, so she really wanted to go back. Cavell, with lightning speed, ran into the room and said that she would play hide-and-seek with him today. At the same time, he again called her trash. The young lady sighed heavily as she understood that God would not fulfill her wish after all. She looked at him in surprise and asked why she should play with someone who called her trash. He shouted in surprise that she had said that he didn't like it, and now she was denying it. The young lady, in turn, froze in shock. She wondered if she had really said something like that. A moment later, she sighed heavily and called her brother. She said that trash always stays in the trash can until it is thrown out. He looked at her in surprise and said that it was all true. She looked at her brother intently and said that for this reason, this trash cannot play with him. Hari said that it was because garbage can only lie around, and that's all it does. The young man froze in shock. She looked at her brother intently and casually said that the trash needed to sleep, and now he could go and play with someone else. The young man froze in shock, and a moment later, he said that he would not call her trash again. Taken aback, he asked her if she was happy now. The young lady, in turn, with a joyful, animated smile, said that she was certainly pleased. A moment later, he told her annoyingly that he would like to play with her. Harry wondered if he thought she was so free that she could play with him all the time. She wanted him to leave soon, as she had been sleeping very badly lately, as all her thoughts were haunting her. With the speed of lightning, the young lady fell into a long sleep. The young man screamed and called for her, but all was in vain. The young lady was sleeping quietly on the sofa when she suddenly heard some noise and slowly opened her eyes. Opening her eyes, she was taken aback as she saw her brother sitting quietly next to her. She looked at him in surprise and called out. Hari quietly asked her brother how long he had been here. She sighed heavily and wondered if she was really back. She slowly reached out to her brother, wanting to know if she had returned or to her wife, because after that day she had always reached out to Eugene just in case. Looking at her brother, it seemed to her that he was protecting a secret that was very dear to him. His gaze softened, and they sat in complete silence. She slowly raised herself and yawned quietly. She looked at her brother intently and said that he should have woken her up. She didn't know when he came. Eugene whispered something quietly in response. She froze in surprise, looking at her brother, as she realized that he was still little. Hari sighed heavily, as she felt like she was back. She was sad, because everything felt familiar. She looked down at her hands as they reached out to him, as if they were close. Hari knew old habits died hard. The young lady looked at her brother closely, and asked what brought him to her. Eugene sighed heavily, and said that his mother asked him to check on her. But the young lady was sleeping, so he stayed. She sighed heavily and turned around as she realized he had lit the fire for her. She looked at her brother in surprise and wondered if he was sick or something like that. A moment later, Eugene extended his hand to her and said that they should go already because it was almost time for dinner. Hari was shocked and did not understand what was happening to him. Now she understood that he began to behave differently after that day in the city. She froze for a moment because she knew that he was no longer telling her that he did not recognize her as a member of the family, that she would never be accepted. She looked closely at the young man because she knew that he was certainly not nice. She understood that in front of her now was a man who reminded her terribly of her brother, whom she knew very well. He slowly rose and walked towards the exit. The young lady screamed and asked him to wait for her. The young lady, in turn, slowly followed her brother. She looked at him intently because she understood that if this was the future, then she would take his hand and be much closer. She understood that such actions would embarrass her greatly, but she still decided to try to do something similar. She slowly walked up to her brother and quietly took his hand. Eugene, in turn, froze in shock. He looked at the young, beautiful lady with bewilderment, as he did not understand why she did something like that. She looked at him confused and surprised, and asked whether they would go further or not. She stared at him, wondering in her mind whether he would let go of her hand or not. She wondered if he would insult her by pulling her hand back. The young man froze in shock, as he understood that he could not have done such a thing. She sighed heavily and told her brother that she was very hungry. Hari wanted to know whether they were going to the dining room or not. Eugene sighed heavily, and looking away from her in embarrassment, said that they were going. They walked slowly past all those present, going to the dining room. The maids were delighted with such actions of the young people, as they saw that it was very nice on their part. A moment later, they were holding hands and walked into the dining room. The Duchess, in turn, beamed with happiness on the spot. She said that seeing them holding hands made her very happy. The Duke looked at the young people with his gentle smile and said that they seemed to have become very close. The young lady looked at the Duke in bewilderment and wondered if she should give him a pair of new eyes. A moment later, she looked intently at her brother, who was staring at her. Looking away, Anna came across another brother who was looking at her with fury. The young lady, in turn, sighed heavily, as she was very worried. Some time later, her worries finally came true, as the young man's prank caused her to fall down the stairs. She looked with fury at the young man, who looked at her with a satisfied, mocking expression. A moment later, Eugene ran up to the young lady and with lightning speed lifted her to her feet. Hari was surprised, as she did not expect such actions from her older brother at all. Eugene looked at his brother with fury and asked if he was aware that the young lady could have broken her leg. Hari was shocked, wondering if Eugene was scolding Eric because of her right now. Eric sighed heavily and said that it all happened by pure chance. The lady, in turn, understood perfectly well that his words sounded simply ridiculous. She knew that in front of her was simply the devil. She sighed heavily and looked at the young man with fury, because she knew that thinking that they could change was her huge mistake. But she was furious because she was a little out of touch with reality. Eugene looked at his brother closely and said that he saw everything that happened here. Eric was in shock. He shouted at his brother and said that it was not his fault at all that the girl fell. He did not understand why he was the only one being scolded. The young lady sighed heavily as she understood that she was the only one left to scold for her own fall. She knew that she still had to be punished for constantly falling for the joke and putting up with bullying. She looked at her brother with a smile and said that she was fine and there was no need to scold Eric. The young man pouted angrily and turned away from her. A moment later, the young lady struck him with lightning speed on the leg, and he fell to the ground with a crash. She looked at him intently and said that, unfortunately, such things happen, and asked if he had not expected this. She looked at him intently and asked why he was looking at her like that, since it was not her fault that he fell. She looked at him with fury and said that next time he should watch carefully where he was going. The young people froze in place in surprise. She smiled softly at her brother and said that she really hoped that he understood everything. She knew that if someone did something nasty to her again, she would return it all tenfold. Some time later, the young lady was taken aback as her beautiful dress was ruined. The Duchess looked at her daughter in surprise and asked if she was all right. The young man sighed heavily and casually asked for forgiveness, and also said that his hand accidentally trembled. The Duchess looked at her son with concern and asked if she hadn't told him to sit down while eating. The Duchess was shocked. She did not understand why tomato juice got on the beautiful dress, because even after washing it, there would be a stain on it. The young lady was furious. She looked angrily at her brother, because she knew that she wanted to wear this dress to meet her future husband. The Duchess, leading the young lady away, said that tears would not help grief, and they would still find her a new dress. Unfortunately, their battle did not end there. None of them had complained to the adults yet, so this was not the end. She understood perfectly well that because their battle was still going on without bruises and injuries, it was impossible to avoid them. Of course, she wasn't as keen on this childish battle as her brother, but she still wasn't going to sit back. She knew he wouldn't get away with it, and she wanted him to answer for ruining the first meeting with her future husband. The Duchess looked closely at the young lady and said that she looked very pretty in that outfit. The Duchess said with a smile that the young lady would look the most beautiful. Hari looked at the Duchess with a smile, as she knew that compliments were always nice to hear. Looking at the Duchess, she wondered if she could delay her revenge a little, for the Duchess's peace of mind. Hari, in turn, was very nervous. She understood perfectly well that she would soon meet her future husband. A moment later, they were informed that the carriage with the guests had arrived at the main gate. The young lady, in turn, shuddered in fear. Eric looked at her in surprise, as he did not understand what was wrong with her. The Duchess looked closely at the children and said that it was time for them to greet the guests. The man looked at the Duke intently and said with a smile that he was always amazed by the amazing appearance of the mansion. The Duke thanked him with a smile for his kind words. The man smiled and said that they wanted to thank them for the invitation, because they had many pleasant memories associated with the mansion, and also they had not seen each other for a long time. The Duke and Duchess looked at the guests intently, for they were very glad to see them. The man looked at Eugene intently, and said with a smile that he was very similar to his father. Eugene thanked Sir Bastier for the kind words. Sir looked at the other son with a gentle smile, as he must have been having a good time enjoying something tasty before their arrival. He smiled and apologized for their quick arrival. Everyone looked askance at the young man. Cavell involuntarily cried out in shock, as he did not expect such a thing. A moment later, the young people greeted Mr. and Mrs. in unison. Sir looked at the young men in surprise and asked if they were really at the age when their baby teeth fell out. The young men were taken aback, as if he had killed two birds with one stone. He looked at them with a gentle smile and said that they reminded him of his children, because they were as cute as they were. The young lady was shocked. She didn't think that their meeting would take place without her front teeth. She looked at the guests in surprise, as she did not understand where their children were. She wondered if they had come separately, or if they had stayed at home. She knew that if they had stayed at home, it would have been just perfect. The man looked at them intently and said with a smile that losing their front teeth at the same time was very funny, and something else he could not expect from twins. The young man, in turn, clenched his fists in rage. A moment later, the young man ran to the side with lightning speed. For a moment, there was dead silence in the room. The man sighed heavily and apologized, as he had spoken without thinking. The Duke looked at the guests intently and asked for forgiveness for his youngest son, as he knew that he still had a lot to learn. The Duke asked the guests where their children were. He said that they seemed to have been distracted by the snowman when they were coming here. The Duke was surprised by this turn of events, because he did not expect such a thing. A moment later, the young man shouted that it was he who made the snowman. The Duchess looked at her son with alarm and said that he should not say that. She corrected him in his sentence. The man looked at them with a smile and said that everything was fine, and since he had made a snowman, he could go and play with their children. The man said that his son was just the same age. Cavell shouted with a joyful smile that this was very good, and he was already running to play. The man looked closely at the young lady and asked if he understood correctly that her name was Hari. Madame looked at the young lady closely and said that she could be the older sister to their daughter that she never had. The madam smiled and told the girl that her daughter was only a year younger than her. Hari, with a radiant smile, told the madam that she could trust her and she would look after the young girl. But a moment after her words, the young lady was taken aback, as these words had burst out automatically from her, because somehow she had succumbed to the influence of the couple. The Duchess looked at the young lady closely and said that she must not forget to put on her coat when she went out, and she also asked her to take another coat with her for her brother. The young lady walked away slowly, carrying a coat for her brother. She did not understand why he did not put on his coat when he ran out into the street. She was in shock and simply could not believe that he just went outside without a finger in such cold weather. A moment later, the young league was taken aback as someone suddenly opened the door, thereby hitting her. She was in shock as it was very dangerous. The young lady, in turn, froze in place in surprise when she saw her future husband in front of her. The young man looked at her with embarrassment, because he was puzzled and did not know what to answer. A moment later, he asked for forgiveness, but suddenly screamed as a snowball hit his head. Cavell looked at the young man with a sneer. The young lady was furious. She did not want her brother to touch her future husband at all. But the young man looked at them with a smile and threw snowballs with lightning speed. She was shocked, because looking at him, she realized that he now looked like a psycho. A moment later, she was taken aback and looked away as she saw a young lady. She noticed that the young lady was standing quietly to the side and watching everyone closely. Hari sighed heavily as she realized that the young lady also thought that Cavell was a complete psycho. Cavell mockingly shouted that even if he was walking, he could dodge the snowballs. The young lady looked at the young man in bewilderment. She wondered if he was trying to protect her. She was shocked to the depths of her soul. She could not believe that her future husband was cool even as a child. A moment later, he shouted at his friend to stop. The young lady froze in shock, and all her dreams came crashing down on her. The young man cried out to his friend that this was too much on his part, since he had already given up. Cavell shouted at the young man to shut his mouth, because he needed to accept that he had lost. The young lady looked at the young man in bewilderment. She wondered if this was really that Johannes. Bastier, whom she knew, she was shocked, wondering if there was really such a big difference between what he was like as a child and what he became as an adult. Cavell looked at the young man with a sneer as he failed to even dodge, but a moment later, a snowball flew at his head. The young lady sprang upon him with lightning speed and shouted at him to stop, as it was very mean of him to do so. Cavell was taken aback and looked at the young lady in surprise, and also asked if she really wanted him to throw snowballs at her. He was furious. He did not understand why she was interfering in something that was none of her business. The young man shouted at him not to offend his sister. The young lady sighed heavily as she saw her brother bullying everyone around her. She knew perfectly well that she simply had to teach him a good lesson. She looked closely at the young man, for she was sure that he was different from the one she had imagined. But still, she was surprised and wondered why he continued to defend her so fiercely. Hari gently touched the young man and asked if he could move away. Johannes was taken aback and shouted for her to stop. The young lady was furious, and because she knew that her brother was simply mercilessly attacking the one who could not resist him, she looked at the young man with fury, as she understood perfectly well that Johannes was her future husband, so there was no forgiveness or mercy for her brother. Cavell said with a joyful smile that no one could defeat him because he was great. In turn, the young lady was not going to tolerate such a thing. She walked up to her brother with lightning speed and hit him, causing him to fall to the ground with a crash. She sighed heavily as she felt relieved that it was finally quiet. But everyone present was surprised and shocked by her actions. The young man looked at the young lady in surprise and intently, as he did not expect such a thing. Cavell looked at the young lady with fury and asked if she had just hit him. He was very angry because he knew that even his father had never hit him. Harry looked at her brother in surprise and asked what he was talking about. She said that she just ran up to him because she was very happy to see him. Hari looked at her brother closely and said with an innocent smile that she even brought him his coat because she thought he might be cold. He looked at her in surprise as he didn't expect her to bring him a coat. She looked at him with a blazing gaze and said that no one wanted him to catch a cold. She looked intently at her brother, as she expected him to quickly believe her. The young man, in turn, was very surprised and did not know what to do. She sighed heavily and looked at him with indignation, because she did not understand why he was hesitating. She looked at her brother with the most innocent look and said that he must have been very tired from the snow fight to fall so easily. The young man froze in shock, because he didn't expect to hear something like that. She gave him her hand with a smile and said that it was time for him to get up. A moment later, the young lady said that there was snow on his back and began to shake it off. At the same time, the young man screamed as he was in pain from her actions. She looked at him intently, as she was glad that he was such a weakling. She looked at the young man intently and said that they had better go inside. Cavell was surprised by such a proposal because he had not yet finished playing. Hari looked at her brother closely and said that she heard that today would be the very cake he had been waiting for so long. She reminded him that Eric had said that he wanted to eat the chocolate dragon from the very top. The young man was taken aback because he wanted to eat it. With lightning speed, he rushed into the house, as he wanted the dragon very much. A moment later, the young lady turned around and told her new friends that they should call it a day and go inside. She looked at them in surprise, as they looked at her with admiration. She was surprised. She did not understand why they were looking at her with their sparkling eyes. The young lady told her new friends that they must be very cold, and therefore they should go inside after all. A moment later, she helped the young man up. Looking at him, she felt like a knight saving a poor lady. The young man looked at her closely, and with an embarrassed smile, asked her what her name was. Hari smiled and introduced herself in response. He smiled and said that she could just call him Johann, and also asked if he could call her by her first name. She looked away from him with an embarrassed expression and said that of course he could call her that. The young lady was puzzled because she didn't understand why she felt like an older sister now. Johannes looked at the young lady with a gentle and embarrassed smile and said that her name was very beautiful. The young lady froze in embarrassment on the spot. A moment later, she ran up to him and grabbed his hands and said that she would always protect him. He smiled and said that he would protect her too. Some time later, they were all sitting at the dinner table. The young lady frowned as she looked at everyone present. She was surprised, and at the same time puzzled, because she did not understand why the young man was looking at her so intently. The man looked at everyone present with a smile, and said that it seemed like their children really liked Hari. The young lady was puzzled, because she even felt a bit awkward. The man looked at everyone present and said that he heard that Johann and Cavell were the same age. He thought that they could become friends. Johannes dropped his cutlery on the ground at his father's words and looked at his father in surprise, trembling. Louise screamed and said that she hated this child. Madame looked at her daughter in surprise and said that she should call him Big Brother. Louise screamed that she hated this brother. Hated him, and that's it. Her parents were shocked. Everyone present was also shocked by her words. The young man looked at them in surprise, chewing the meat with appetite. The Duke sighed heavily as he realized that his son had done something wrong again. The young lady, in turn, looked at the young man with bewilderment, since at that moment he was simply eating. The Duchess looked at them closely and said that her son was just a very energetic child, and perhaps he had gone too far playing outside. Sir smiled and said that she need not worry, because children love to fool around. Hari in turn sighed heavily, because she knew that his children suffered because of the boy. She knew that for this reason, she had unconsciously told Johann that she would protect him in the future. The madam smiled and said that it seemed that their children liked the young lady very much. She asked Hari with a smile to take care of them. The young lady, in turn, looked at Madame with bewilderment, but still agreed. She hoped that Madame would no longer use her charms on her. The young lady, in turn, looked closely at her younger brother. She was interested in what he was feeling now. She saw that he was a little sad, but still decided not to pay attention to it. She hoped that Madame would take care of him, at least a little. Cavell hugged the young man with a smile, said that they could have another snowball fight tomorrow. He persuaded that today had been a lot of fun. Johannes, in turn, shuddered at his words. The young lady, in turn, sighed heavily as she saw that her brother was pestering the young man again. She came closer to her brother and said that he had duck fat left on his face. She showed him where he was left, but all his attempts to wipe the grease from his face were unsuccessful. She sighed heavily and said that she would wipe it all off herself now. She slowly approached the servant and asked him for a handkerchief. She asked her brother to bend over a little with a smile. After a few seconds, she started to wipe his whole face. She didn't understand how he could be so sloppy. The young man winced and cried out that it hurt. Hari looked at him with a gentle smile and asked for forgiveness, because she had to rub several times because she was still weak. She said with a smile that now everything was over and he could go and rest. She hoped he wouldn't think too much and would just leave. The young lady turned around with a smile and looked at Mr. Butler and said that she would return the handkerchief to him after she had washed it. He looked at her with a smile and said that she seemed to like the young master very much. The young lady in turn was taken aback, as she did not expect to hear such a thing. He smiled and said that she was still young, but still cared about her brothers first and foremost. She was shocked as she understood that this was not the case at all. He stroked her head with a smile and said that she was very kind and attentive. Johannes looked at her and said that she was very good. A moment later, Eugene approached them and asked in surprise when she had managed to become so close to Hubert. The young lady looked at him in surprise, as she did not expect to see him. He looked at her intently and said that Hubert didn't like children. She looked at him in surprise and said that Mr. was very kind. He looked at her in surprise and asked if she really wanted something from him. Hari wondered if he was going to say something rude about her just pretending to be nice or something like that. She looked at the young man closely as she realized that he had no intention of doing this. She was puzzled because she didn't know what he wanted from her, and she hoped that he would tell her sooner. Hari looked intently at the young man and asked if that was what he really wanted. He shuddered and reached out to her. A moment later, he turned around with lightning speed and said that he didn't want anything. She looked after him in surprise, because she didn't understand what had happened. The young lady stared at the young man, but she did not understand what had happened and why he was behaving in such a way. A moment later, she was taken aback and turned around as she felt someone's hand on her head. She looked at the young man in surprise. She asked him, puzzled, what he was doing. He was taken aback, but a moment later said that he thought it was her brother who wanted to do it. The young lady sighed heavily and said with a smile that it was simply impossible. She understood perfectly well that something like this would never happen. Johannes looked at her closely and said that it was not so, and he was sure that was what Eugene wanted to do. Hari, looking at the young man, said that he knew nothing about her brother, while she called him Johann's brother. He looked at her in surprise and asked sheepishly if she could say it again. She looked at him in surprise and asked if he really wanted to hear again that he knew nothing about her brother. Johannes timidly said that he would like to hear the words she had spoken before. She looked at him in surprise and again called him brother. The young man suddenly twitched before her eyes and looked intently at her. She was shocked. She didn't understand how he could radiate such a pure aura of a harmless creature. A moment later, she said she needed to go back to the room. Johannes looked closely at the young lady and said that they could go together. She looked at him in bewilderment and asked why he was following her. She knew that their rooms were on different sides. The young man's face sank. He couldn't answer her question. Hari looking at him, she realized that he didn't know the way back, so she wondered if she should see him off. She understood that everything was fine, since he could not know the way back. The young man said that this was not so, and he knew the way back, and he could get there himself. He looked at her intently and said that, to tell the truth, he just wanted to be with her for much longer. The young lady froze in place in embarrassment. Johannes told his companion that he would remain silent so as not to cause her any inconvenience. He looked at her intently and asked if he could stay by her side. Hari was surprised but still agreed. He asked with a smile if he could then take her hand. The young lady agreed, and they walked slowly. Johannes looked closely at the young lady and asked with a smile what she usually liked to do. They walked down the corridor for a while and had a leisurely conversation. The next day, the hunt began. Today, the prey was 2 silver foxes, a deer, and a black yak. Cavell insisted very much on his participation in the next hunt. Eric, traumatized by the death of his sister, quickly left the hunting grounds due to nausea. Louise looked at the young lady closely and asked about Brother Eric. She was puzzled and did not understand why he was always sick. She was worried and asked if he had a weak body. Hari sighed heavily and said that it was not that. He was just not feeling well these past few days, and seeing the dead fox and deer had left him deeply shocked. She said that her brother had a dog. The young lady sighed heavily and said that young brother was too kind. The young lady sighed heavily and said that right now he was probably crying in his room because he looked very fragile, and even his hair was silver. Hari knew perfectly well that her brother looked pure and innocent, like an angel, only on the outside. Louise thought for a moment and said that it worried her very much, because he had eaten little since yesterday. The young lady looked at her in bewilderment and asked why she didn't visit him since she was so worried. Louise looked at her in bewilderment and asked why she would do that. Hari said that she herself had said earlier that she was worried about him, crying in his room. Louise said that it didn't bother her enough to visit her. Besides, they weren't even close. The young lady said that she understood everything, but in turn, she was surprised, as the girl was quite straightforward and frank. Cavell burst into their room with lightning speed and shouted to the young lady that she must come and play with him. Hari sighed heavily when she saw her brother, but did not answer. A moment later, she said she wanted to play with dolls with Louise, and she also asked if he wanted to join them. Louise screamed as she didn't want him to join them. Cavell shouted angrily that he didn't want to do that. He said they could play with the ball and he would bring it right away. A moment later, he closed the door with lightning speed. The young ladies stared at the closed door, but no one said anything. A moment later, Hari asked her friend if she wanted to play in the other room. She knew perfectly well that they should leave quickly before her brother returned. A moment later, they left the room in a hurry and were walking slowly into another, when suddenly Louise saw her brother. She looked at him in surprise and asked where he had been. And a moment later, she said that they were going to play in the other room and he should come with them too. He looked at Hari intently and asked if he could join in. The young lady thought for a moment, as she knew that he always asked her permission first. She truly felt his care, which she had never felt from the three brothers. And a moment later, she said with a smile that of course he could go with them. The young lady, in turn, hoped very much that her brother would not find them too quickly. Cavell came into their room. He looked at them closely, and with a joyful smile, said that he found them all. Hari was shocked by his speed, because he managed to find them. And besides, he also brought a dog. Eric looked at his brother with fury, and asked what he was doing, and also said that he could not drag the dog around with him wherever he wanted. Cavell, looking at his brother, he said that in that case he could play with them. The young lady was shocked. His words did not make her want to play with him at all. Cavell walked up to his sister with lightning speed and said with a smile that he had brought the ball and even brought her favorite dog. The young lady looked at him with alarm and shouted at him to let her go. Johannes looked intently at the young man and asked if he couldn't hear his sister. Cavell looked at the young man in surprise and asked what was wrong with him. He said that if he was not going to join them, he should leave. A moment later, Cavell shouted at his brother not to take the dog. He pulled the young lady towards him, and she screamed. But a moment later, he was taken aback, because she fell right in front of him. Holding her hand, he shouted that she should get up quickly. The young lady, in turn, looked at the young man with fury. She also resisted him, as she wanted to take her hand back. Johannes walked up to the young man with lightning speed, and, taking him by the hand, said that he must apologize immediately to his sister. Hari froze for a moment in surprise, as she didn't expect this. She looked closely at the young man, and wondered if this was the same innocent young boy in front of her. Cavell looked at the young man in surprise, and asked what was wrong with him and why he should apologize. The boy looked at him intently, and said that he grabbed his sister by the hand and shouted at her. He said that even though they were related, he should not do that to her. He looked at him intently and said that precisely because they were related, he should not treat her like that and should apologize. He said that the young man was wrong because he behaved as he pleased. Cavell looked at the young man with fury. A moment later, he screamed and told him not to make him laugh. Cavell was furious and didn't understand who he was to tell him what to do. Cavell shouted in anger and pointed at the young lady. He said that she was not his sister at all. Johannes looked at him in surprise and asked what he had just said. The young man shouted again that she was not his sister at all. Johannes looked angrily at the young man and asked what was wrong with him. Cavell froze for a moment at the question. Johannes looked at the young man intently and asked if she was not his sister. Then who was she? The young lady sighed heavily. She knew that he shouldn't have said such things without thinking. Johannes looked at everyone present and told the young man that he could give her to him in that case. The young lady froze in bewilderment. She looked at him intently, not understanding what he had just said. Cavell looked at the young man intently and asked what he had said. Johannes screamed that he had to give her to him, and he could treat her much better than the likes of him. Louise looked at him intently and said that it was all right, and he should give her to them, and from today, she would be her older sister. Everyone froze in surprise for a moment. Johannes looked at the young man intently and said that he was the most vile and mean child he had ever known, and he was sure that one day he would regret what he had said. Johannes, looking at him, said that the young lady was several times better than him. Cavell looked at him with fury and asked if he had finished speaking. With lightning speed, Cavell pounced on the young man with his fists and sent him packing. Hari was taken aback and looked at her brother in surprise and asked what he had done. She wanted to know why he had hit her brother Johann. Cavell's Labna asked the young lady if she was taking his side right in front of him. She looked at him in surprise and asked why she should take his side. She said that she was not even his sister and did not understand why she would do such a thing. She looked at him sharply and said that brother Johann had said everything correctly, but he had hit him anyway. Cavell asked furiously why she thought he was right. She looked at him intently, asking what the young man had said wrong. Cavell shuddered and froze in place from such a question. Cavell shouted that everything the young man said was wrong. He was furious and did not understand why she took his side. Louise, with tears in her eyes, said that the young man was bad because he offended her brother every day. Johannes stood up with lightning speed and looked angrily at the young man. A moment later, he rushed towards him in a hurry. Everyone froze in shock on the spot. Johannes struck his attacker with lightning speed. Cavell was taken aback by the shock and asked the young man in surprise why he had just hit him. Johannes looked at him with fury and said that he started this fight. Cavell shouted at him in anger that he would kill him. Louise was confused. She shouted at the young man to calm down. Harry stood frozen for a moment, in shock and surprise. She didn't understand why they were making so much noise. She didn't understand what was going on at all. She shouted at them to calm down, but it was all in vain. Eric ran like lightning to his mother and called her, and like lightning they came into the room and shouted to their sons to calm down. Hari quickly rushed towards her brother, trying to pull him away. She begged him to stop, but in the heat of the fight, he pushed her away and hit her in the nose with his elbow. The young lady staggered from the blow and recoiled. A moment later, she fell to the ground with a thud and noticed that her nose was broken. The Duchess rushed excitedly to the young lady and asked if she was all right. Madame looked at the young lady closely and told her to take the handkerchief and not let go of her head. The Duchess was worried and did not understand why the bleeding did not stop. She was very worried that the young lady could become ill with the speed of lightning. She called the butler. Johannes approached the young lady and with tears in his eyes asked how she was, and also asked for forgiveness. She smiled and told him that she was fine and that he shouldn't worry. A moment later, the butler entered their room. He froze in shock when he saw the young lady. The Duchess told the butler to hurry and call a doctor, but first they had to stop the bleeding. Louise was taken aback and looked at her young sister with tears in her eyes and asked her not to die. Hari sighed heavily because she knew that she would not die because of such nonsense, but she did not answer her. She was puzzled and wondered when her life in this house would become peaceful. A moment later, the Duke burst into their room, shocked by what was happening. Hari looked at them in surprise and wondered why they were looking at her like that. She wondered if they were really that panicked about the nosebleed. She sighed heavily as she realized that her entire dress was stained with blood. She sighed heavily as she realized that she needed to change her clothes first. The Duke and Duchess scolded their son for such an incident. They locked him in a room and told him that he should think about his own behavior. The Duke looked at his friend and said that he just couldn't believe that his son fought with his fists. The man smiled and said that it was very funny because now he sees that his son can also fight back. As he thought, children grow up fighting. The Duchess, puzzled, said that she really didn't know what to say and asked for forgiveness again. The lady looked at them intently and with a soft smile said that they should not scold their son too much because it was just a childish quarrel. The young lady, in turn, understood perfectly well that her brother was to blame for everything, but she felt relieved when the young spouses did not attach much importance to this. She looked closely at the mirror as she noticed that she looked much better after changing her clothes. In turn, Hari strongly hoped that Johannes was completely okay. A moment later, she heard a knock on the door. She looked at her brother in surprise, because she didn't understand why he came to her. Eugene looked closely at the young lady and asked if she had stopped the bleeding. She said that it was fine now and that she had stopped it a long time ago, but it was very heavy. Eugene looked at her intently and said that from tomorrow onwards, he would be staying in the mansion. Hari asked in surprise if he really wouldn't be hunting. He said that they would hunt, and anyway he doesn't like hunting. Eugene looked closely at the young lady and said that her nose was still a little red. She sighed heavily and reaching for her nose, said that it was not only red, but also painful. Eugene sighed heavily and asked her for forgiveness. Hari looked at him in bewilderment, as she did not expect to hear something like that. She sighed and said that it wasn't his fault at all. She didn't understand why he was apologizing to her now. Eugene sighed heavily and said that it was all because his brother did this to her. Hari looked at the young man and said that you should say such things, "Get well soon," or that he is worried about the immaturity of his brother. The young man froze for a moment, not expecting anything like this. She looked at him intently and said that he had no need to apologize for what his younger brother had done. Taking her gaze away from him, she said that the only one who should ask for her forgiveness was his brother. Eugene sighed heavily and said that she was completely right about that. A moment later, he reached closer to her and stroked her head tenderly. She was surprised, because she had not expected anything like this. Eugene quietly said that it must be difficult for her to cope with children alone. She froze in surprise. Eugene looked at her intently and said that from now on, she should call him if something like that happened. Hari was taken aback and stared after him. She wondered if he had eaten something wrong. She thought that most likely the sun would rise in the west tomorrow, when he did unexpected things that were not typical for him. A moment later, Johannes entered the young lady's room and called her. He looked at her intently and asked for forgiveness, because she suffered because of him. She looked at him in surprise and said that this was not so, and everything happened because of her brother Cavell. She looked closely at the young man, because she understood that seeing what his beautiful face had become, she became very angry with her brother, and even more so. Johannes sighed heavily and timidly said that she was not an object at all, and he selfishly asked to give her to him. He once again asked her for forgiveness, with tears in his eyes. Hari was shocked as his aura blinded her to madness. She wondered how he grew up so flawless and wonderful. She said with a smile that everything was fine, and confidently he did not want to treat her like an object. She smiled and asked if he had treated his wounds yet. He smiled and said that he was fine. Louise looked over her brother's shoulder and said that the young man was really very bad. She looked at the young lady intently and said menacingly that he was a stupid idiot and a blockhead. Hari sighed heavily, as she couldn't help but agree with her words. Louise looked at the young lady intently and asked if she really couldn't live with them. She said that her brother was much better than them. Louise looked at the young lady and said that she had heard that she used to live on the street. Louise said that in that case, they might as well throw the brothers out there. There was a dead silence for a moment. She said that her nanny had told her that there was a terrible monster living outside. Louise said that, for that reason, if they take bad children there, he will teach them a good lesson. Louise asked if her little sister had lived with a monster before she came here. She said that she felt very sorry for her. Johannes looked at his sister and said that the nanny only said that to scare her, and there was no monster there. She looked at her brother in bewilderment and asked what kind of place it was then. Johannes was taken aback, not knowing what to say, and a moment later said that it was a place where ordinary people lived. He sighed heavily and said that he liked Hari too, so much that nothing else mattered to him. Louise said with a happy smile that nothing mattered to her either, and she liked her very much. Johannes looked at the young lady with a timid smile and said that they were leaving, and they would all see each other later at dinner. Louise, leaving, asked her little sister to play with them again after dinner. They left, and she was left all alone. Hari knew perfectly well that in Mellington, she took where no one saw her and did not call her by name. She sighed heavily, for she knew that she was alone there, but she also knew that she was alone here too. Some time later, they gathered for dinner, and Madame praised the very warm welcome and delicious dinner. Madame said with a smile that if it was possible, she would like to invite their chef to their place. The Duchess said with a smile that he would be very glad to hear such praise. The Duchess looked after the young lady with a joyful smile. Hari looked closely at the delicious food, because when she was homeless, she was happy to have at least stale bread. The Duchess asked the young lady if she wanted to try anything else. Hari smiled and said that she didn't want anything else, as everything was very tasty. She watched everyone present closely, because they were talking casually about her. She quietly looked at everyone, because someone was eating, and someone was asking for more. Harry looked hard at the Duchess and asked if she was going to see Cavell. The Duchess said she was very sorry that he had dined alone, so she would like to go and see him. She looked at the young ladies closely and said that she was sure he would behave well after yesterday's reprimand, so they could not worry anymore, because he would think carefully about his behavior. As she left, the Duchess told the young ladies that if they wanted, she would tell him not to run away with them until they wanted it themselves. She smiled tenderly and said that they need not worry about it. Hari sighed heavily, knowing that she couldn't let the little child languish in the room for so long. She was worried when the young man's punishment ended, but he went hunting with Eugene. Hari was very glad that there was silence around, but while walking down the corridor, she accidentally bumped into her brother. She looked away from him, puzzled, because she knew that not even a couple of seconds had passed since she thought about silence. Eric looked at her intently and said that they were not alike at all. He did not understand how they could claim that they were the same. He shouted that it was so disgusting that it simply infuriated him. The young lady sighed heavily, as she now realized that he was talking about what they had been told earlier. She thought for a moment, and after a few seconds said that there were attacks. Because he was much more beautiful than her, Eric froze for a moment in surprise. He looked at her with confusion, and shouted that she shouldn't confuse him like that. Harishi looked at him and asked if she had said something funny. She asked if he really thought he was so ugly. Eric shouted embarrassedly that he was handsome. She looked at him with a grin and said that he had some strange prejudices, because beauty does not depend on gender. She looked at him intently and with a sweet smile said that he was the cutest creature she had ever met. Eric shouted that this was not so. She said that by his logic, she, being a girl, should be much prettier than him. She smiled and said that, in truth, she was prettier, but he claimed otherwise. Eric was shocked, with an embarrassed look on his face. He left her with the speed of lightning and shouted that she was annoying. Some time later, the young lady was quietly resting in her room, but an unexpected guest showed up to her. Cavell looked at her intently and asked with a smile if she had seen what kind of deer he had caught. With lightning speed, the young lady sat down on the bed and sighed heavily. He asked with a satisfied smile, "Wasn't he great? He thought he was cool since he caught a deer." She sighed heavily because she understood that he was being careful with her all these days, but it seemed that he had already recovered from his punishment. She sighed heavily again and said that he was amazing. Cavell said with delight that he had been told that gloves could be made from the skin. She said dryly that she understood him. He looked at her intently and said with a smile that he could have them made just for her. She sighed heavily and said that she did not need that. She coldly looked away from him and said that she didn't need them at all. Cavell looked at her in surprise and asked why she didn't need them. The young lady sighed heavily, as she understood that he had not thought about his behavior at all. A moment later, he snatched her little toy from her hands. Cavell Neve shouted that he said he would order gloves for her. Hari was furious as he was constantly pestering her. She said that she was not his sister, and she had no reason to accept anything from him. The young man froze in place and was taken aback by her words. She came closer to him and, looking at him menacingly, took her frog away. She sighed heavily and said that because of him, her leg was now twisted. The young man was taken aback and asked if she had just addressed him informally, since it was impolite to address older people in such a way. Hari sighed heavily and said that her friend was coming to see her soon, so he should stop bothering her and should leave quickly. The young man was taken aback and, reaching out to her, said that it was true that she was not his sister. Hari sighed heavily and said that she was indeed not his sister, and she had told him the same thing earlier. The young man was taken aback and cried out in surprise that he had not meant that at all. She came closer to him and asked what he meant then. He growled angrily in response and asked why she addressed him informally. She said that he didn't want a complete stranger calling him brother. Hari said that she didn't want to do that either. She didn't want to address a boy who wasn't her own as a brother. The young man froze in place in surprise, as he had not expected to hear anything like that at all. A moment later, Johannes entered her room. She greeted him with a joyful smile and called him brother. She smiled and asked if he had come at Louise's request. He said that it was true, and she was waiting in her room. Hari smiled and said that then they could go to her place, and she called him brother. Cavell was puzzled. He shouted at the young lady to stop, as they had not finished their conversation yet. She looked at him intently and said that she had nothing more to say to him. Hari asked if he really wanted to tell her something. Cavell looked at the young man sharply and told him not to cut in line, as he had just been talking to the young lady. Johannes looked at him sharply and said that she had no further intention of talking to him. Cavell looked at the young man with fury and shouted that he was still the same idiot who was always hanging around his sister. Johannes looked at him intently and said that he thought it was him who was coming here, because that was what he thought. Johannes looked at him closely and asked, and apologized to the young lady before saying all this, since she suffered because of them. Cavell froze in place for a moment. Hari looked intently at Johann, and calming him down, said that there was enough rubbish. She looked at him intently and said that he didn't need to waste his time arguing, because he wouldn't listen to him anyway. She said that they could leave him and go about their business. Cavell froze in shock on the spot, because he didn't expect this. She looked at the young man closely and asked if he knew how to make origami. He smiled and said that he could make a rabbit and a forest, as well as a turtle. She looked at him in surprise and asked if it was true, as she was incredibly surprised by his skills. She sighed heavily and said that she could only make a frog, but he said that he would definitely teach her. Cavell ran out of the room with lightning speed and asked if they were really ignoring him. Cavell looked at the young lady intently and asked why she was always like this. He was agitated and did not understand why she continued to ignore him. Eugene looked at his brother intently and told him to leave the young lady alone. Cavell. Asking his brother to tell her something, Eugene looked at his brother in surprise and asked what he should tell him, since the young lady had already answered that she did not want to play with him. The young man was taken aback, because he did not expect anything like this from his brother. With the speed of lightning, he shouted to his brother that he hated him and ran to his room. Eugene looked closely at his young sister and asked if she liked Johann and Louise. Hari froze in surprise, because she did not have time to understand when he managed to come so close to her. She smiled and said that she liked them, because they were very cute and fun to play with. Eugene sighed heavily and said that she would probably be upset, because they would soon be leaving. The young lady was puzzled and saddened. She wondered when they would be able to see each other if they parted now. She knew that they might only see each other in a few years. Eugene looked at her closely and told her that she didn't need to worry, because she would see them soon. She was puzzled because no matter how much she tried to remember, they weren't part of her childhood memories. He said that the hunting season had been great, and they had kept in touch with each other over the years. She knew perfectly well that the difference between the present and her memories had all started after Eugene's conversation with his parents. She looked closely at the young man, wondering if it was because of him that the changes were happening. Eugene slowly walked closer to her and stroked her head tenderly. He said that it would be difficult for her to see the guys because they lived very far away, but this only meant that she should contact them more often. He smiled tenderly at her and said that they loved her too, so their friendship would not end so easily. He smiled a gentle smile and said that she didn't need to be sad about it. The young lady froze in embarrassment. In fact, she was very curious about what he had eaten that made him behave like that. Cavell looked at the young lady with irritation and asked why she played only with Johann all day, when he wasn't even her brother. She sighed heavily and said that it was because she liked him, and it was a lot of fun to play with him. He looked at her in surprise and asked what about him, because he also played well with her and even gave her his treats last time. The young lady was furious and did not want to listen to him at all. She looked at him intently and said that he always comes to her and says, "Let's play," but then just drags her away without even waiting for her answer. He looked at her in surprise and asked if she didn't like to play with him. She looked at him intently and asked if she had ever said anything like that. Hari sighed heavily and said that he always just dragged her around. She looked at him intently and asked if he knew that she got a bruise every time she played with him. She asked if she hadn't said that before. She wanted to know if he ever thought about whether his games were right for her. Hari said that instead of playing tag around the house, she prefers to make origami, and also she doesn't like playing with a ball because it's not fun for her. She said that he doesn't think about it at all. She looked at him intently and said that of course she had never said she didn't want to play with him. Cavell came closer to her and said that she had never said she didn't like playing with him. Hari sighed heavily and said that it was true. And the reason she held back and played with him was because she liked Brother Cavell so much. The young man froze in shock because he didn't expect to hear something like that. He looked at her sheepishly and asked if it was true and she liked him. He asked me if she liked him better than the annoying boy. She looked at him hard and said that of course she liked him better. Hari looked at the young man and asked if he himself had not shouted in front of everyone that she was not his sister. He was taken aback and said that he had simply been very angry at the young man then. She looked at him intently and said that she was very sad because of his words, so now she doesn't love him anymore. She said that Brother Johann always asked her first if she wanted to do something with him, and if he makes a mistake, he immediately apologizes. Cavell looked at her intently and said that he could do all this too. The young lady looked at him with a smirk, as he had fallen into her trap. She sighed heavily and said that she didn't want to play with her brother, who couldn't admit his mistakes and apologize for them. He sighed heavily and said excitedly that he just didn't know that she was so easily hurt. She looked at him intently and asked if he really thought he was right, if he didn't know he had to apologize. A moment later, the young man cried out that it was his fault. He looked away in my direction and said that he had never apologized before, so he didn't know how to do it properly, but he still apologized for hurting her. She looked at him intently and sighed heavily, saying that she didn't know if she could trust him now. He looked at her in surprise and cried out. She asked if he had just raised his voice at her. The young man sighed heavily and said that he had not done that at all. The couple looked closely at the Duke and Duchess, and with a joyful smile invited them to visit their estate next time. The young man looked intently at the young lady and called her with a smile. He slowly walked closer to her and said that he wanted to give her a gift. She looked at him in surprise, as she did not expect such a thing. She was taken aback and froze in place, as she saw a very expensive sphere for communication. He smiled and said that if she did not mind, then they could contact sometimes. The Duchess was taken aback and said that they could not accept the gift as it was a very precious thing, Sir Smile, and said that his son did not mind giving up birthday presents for several years for the sake of the young lady, so they simply had no choice. The lady smiled and said that their son had become more open than before, so they were very happy, and they thought it would be very good if the children kept in touch with each other. Johannes looked at Hari timidly and said that if she didn't like talking to him, then she didn't have to. He said that she could also talk to others through the sphere. Hari said with a smile that it was simply impossible that she wouldn't like to chat with him. Hari looked at him with a radiant smile and thanked him. Some time later, they said goodbye to the guests. Eugene looked closely at the young lady and said with a smile that he was very glad that she had made new friends. He smiled and said that thanks to the sphere she could even see their faces for a while. He smiled and said that was very cool. She knew that even though it was noisy, confusing, and sometimes difficult, she thought it wouldn't be so bad to have days as noisy as today. The Duchess smiled and said that their favorite snacks would be brought today, and also asked what they would like. Eugene smiled and said that anything would do for him. Cavell smiled and said that he would like to try pecan pie. Eric said with a smile that he would like strawberry pie. The Duchess looked closely at the young lady and asked what she would like to taste. She smiled and said that any dessert would do for her. Another winter passed, which she spent at the estate. Soon it became warmer, and spring came. The Duchess greeted the young people with a smile and asked for forgiveness for being late. They were all sitting at a picnic on a beautiful day. Eric looked at the young lady and said that he agreed to take the balloon just so she wouldn't bother him. He shouted that it was so childish, but she still loved it. The young lady looked at him intently, as she could see that he liked it, since she could clearly see the corners of his lips twitching. She smiled and said he should just watch her deer's antlers glow. He looked at her in surprise and asked what she was talking about. Eric looked at her in bewilderment and asked why she used up all her magic in half an hour. She looked at him intently, and he asked in bewilderment why she was looking at him like that. She asked if he hadn't said earlier that he didn't like balloons. Eric looked at her intently and said that she should move away from him. The Duke looked at the young lady with a smile and said that they could buy her another balloon. She shouted that they shouldn't do that because they were very expensive, and she thought it was a waste of money. A moment later, she turned around and saw that the young man had run away in a hurry. She looked at him in bewilderment, as she did not understand why he was in such a hurry. The Duchess looked at her with a joyful smile and asked if she would like some pudding. With the speed of lightning, the young lady threw all her thoughts away, and with a joyful smile, the Duchess said that she would not mind eating the pudding. Eugene looked at her intently and handed her the orange pudding. She looked at him in surprise, because she knew that he also liked orange pudding. He looked at her confusedly and said that she should take it anyway. The Duchess smiled as she handed her son the orange pudding and said she liked both. Eugene looked at his mother closely and said that he was fine. She smiled and said that he still had to accept it. The young lady knew that the Duke and Duchess were originally supposed to have had an accident 6 months ago. She knew that there had never been such a peaceful day as today in the past. The Duke looked at his son and said that he was going to take him with him, since Eugene was staying. he would have to behave well. The young man happily said that he would do everything. Last time, the young lady acted like a madwoman to prevent an accident. She suddenly described when the Duchess took her hand. The Duchess smiled tenderly and said that the flowers were very beautiful today. Late at night, the young lady woke up because she wanted to drink some water. She slowly went downstairs and saw the Duchess. The Duchess looked at her in surprise and asked where she was going. The young lady smelled alcohol on the Duchess. The Duchess smiled and asked the girl if she had really come here to see her mother. The Duchess smiled softly at the young lady. Hari Yi said that she was not Arena at all. The Duchess was taken aback and stood still for a moment, but after a few seconds, she asked the young lady's forgiveness and said that she was also their child. The Duchess embraced the young lady tenderly. A moment later, Eric came down to them. The Duchess looked at her son with a smile and told him to come over. Eugene looked at his mother in surprise and asked if she had drunk anything. The Duchess smiled and said that she was in such a good mood that she didn't even notice how she drank the glass. She looked closely at her son and said with a smile that he was still a child that they had to take care of. Eugene looked at his mother in surprise, as he didn't expect to hear something like that. She looked at him with embarrassment and with a smile asked for forgiveness and said that it seemed she really was drunk. A moment later, the Duke approached them. He looked at his wife in surprise and asked if she was drunk. He asked in surprise if she had been drinking alone, because he knew that they had to leave early the next day and was worried that she would not be okay. She smiled and said that, of course, she would be okay in the morning. He looked at his wife intently and said that in that case they could go to the bedroom. Cavell approached them and asked with a surprised smile if they were doing everything here without him. Eric looked at him with fury and asked if he had really taken his toy. The young man screamed. The young lady sighed heavily. She didn't understand how things had turned into this, because she just wanted to drink some water. The Duke looked at his son and said that he had to get up early tomorrow, and if he did not wake up, he would leave him at home. The young man shouted that he would wake up, and his father should not leave him at home. The Duke looked at everyone present with a smile and said that they would leave first, but everyone else should quickly return to their rooms and go to bed. They looked closely at the young people, and with a smile wished them sweet dreams. After another day, the evening came, and urgent news was delivered to the estate. There was a surprise attack on the hunting grounds. The middle son is in critical condition. The Duke and Duchess passed away. The young lady was furious and angry, as she, unfortunately, could not change anything. The Duchess looked at the young lady intently and interrupted her wife, asking if she was hungry. She guessed that the young lady had not eaten anything all day. Then she thought that there were just strange people in front of her. The Duchess, son with a gentle smile, looked at her and said that she was selling very beautiful flowers. It wasn't that there wasn't a grateful woman who wouldn't treat her with compassion, but this was the first time a man had looked at her kindly and not held her. The Duchess asked with a smile if she could give her all the flowers in the basket. The young lady looked at her in surprise and asked if she really wanted to buy all the flowers. She sighed heavily and said that she didn't know how many flowers were in the basket, and she needed to count them. The Duchess looked at her intently and asked if she would like to go with them. Melissa said she knew it was too sudden to ask, but she still didn't think she could just leave her there. The young lady froze in surprise for a moment, as she did not expect to hear such a thing. She understood perfectly well that if she went back to the past, she would make the same choice. They said that they had organized an assassination attempt on the imperial grandson in order to prevent the imperial grandson from attacking. They put the Ernsts in the carriage, but in the middle of the journey they were attacked. Therefore, in order to break away from the enemies, they had to speed up, and as a result the carriage overturned, and the Duke and Duchess died. When they discovered the dead spouses, it was clear that they had hugged the two children tightly, thereby protecting them from death. At the funeral, everyone whispered and said that the Duke and Duchess had saved the heir to the royal family, because they remained the Emperor's sword until the very end. Everyone knew that since they protected the Emperor's grandson at the cost of their own lives, in the future the Emperor would be lenient towards their family. But they still believed that the family was in a dangerous position, but they knew that the family had an heir, and he would now take care of everything. Everyone stared at the young lady and whispered among themselves, for they knew that the Duke and Duchess had only adopted her last year, and they said that charity work was one of the Duchess's hobbies, but they condemned her because she had not shed a tear. The young lady sighed heavily because she knew that it was true and she did not save them, but she knew that they saved her. She was furious and did not understand why then she could not save them in return. She wanted them to live so much. She wondered why the tears didn't come, even when she was sad. The lady looked closely at the young man and said that if he was in a very difficult situation, he could contact them at any time. She said that their children were very worried about them, and as soon as they had free time, they should let him know. They said that he could count on them, because in difficult times they could count on each other. Eugene looked at them intently and thanked them for their kind words. The young lady looked at them intently, wondering if she could stay in the family now that the Duke and Duchess were dead. Eugene, who became the head of the family, was so busy that he had no time to sleep at all, so he and Eric were left alone in the house. Hari knocked on the door and told her brother that he needed to eat. He shouted that he didn't want anything. A moment later, she and the servants entered the room. The butler looked at the gentleman intently and said that even if he had no appetite, he must eat and not skip meals. The maid slowly placed the dish on the stand, but he angrily knocked it over, and with tears in his eyes, shouted that he had already told them that he did not want anything. The young lady looked at him intently. She knew that even though this was happening to her for the second time, it was still difficult for her to bear such things. To be honest, she didn't know what to do now. Now her brother was still being treated in the Count's house, and she missed him very much. The butler looked at the young lady intently and said that she must eat. He looked at her closely and said that the Duke had informed her that he would have to leave early, so she did not have to worry about the young master. Unlike Eric, who ate almost nothing, she did not skip meals. She understood perfectly well that food is a person's health, and if he is hungry, he only becomes even more depressed. She knew that Eugene had told them he would come early, but looking out the window, she saw that it was already dark and he had not yet arrived. Having collected her thoughts, she nevertheless went to her brother, but he shouted that she had to leave. She sighed heavily and asked if he was going to continue this any longer. Without looking at the young lady, he asked what business it was of hers. He shouted that she should leave, as he did not want to see her. A moment later, he angrily threw the toy she had brought him earlier at her. The young lady slowly picked it up. A few minutes later, Eugene entered the room and called his brother. He looked closely at the young lady and informed her that he needed to speak to his brother. Some time later, the young man came out of the room after a long conversation with his brother. He looked at everyone present and said that his brother should not go hungry tomorrow, and therefore they should pay special attention to this. She looked at him intently and wondered if he had eaten superpowers. The young lady sighed heavily and wondered if she had nothing more to say to him. She knew that if anyone saw them now, they would think that she could only talk to him about food. Eugene sighed heavily and, looking at the young lady, said that he had eaten, and also asked if she had eaten. She said that she had already eaten. He looked at her intently and said that in that case she should go to her room and rest. Hari looked after him intently as she saw that he was very tired. She sighed heavily and, putting the toy down, left the room. Unfortunately, she noticed that the young man had become very nervous. She knew that this happened because he was too young, and conflicts often arose at aristocratic gatherings. Hari slowly walked up to her brother's office and heard the butler telling him to ask other relatives for help. Eugene looked at him in surprise and asked who he meant. Some time later, Eugene informed that from today onwards, the aunt would stay in the mansion and look after them. The Marquise smiled and told Eugene that the children would take care of her, so he didn't need to worry. The Marquise looked closely at Eric. She was shocked. She didn't understand why he had lost so much weight. She hoped that he wasn't starving, because she understood that this was not right. A moment later, the Marquise looked intently at the young lady she had seen last time. Hari knew very well that the Marquise was the person who had disliked her the most throughout the entire time she had been with the family. The Marquise smiled and told the young man that he should eat more, and she also told him that she had brought him many gifts. For this reason, she wanted him to eat quickly and go open them. The young lady noticed that the Marquise pretended that she was not there. She sighed heavily as she saw that the young man was still getting better when one of the adults looked after him, but she was still worried about her brother. but she heard that he was already getting better. During the meal, she became too absorbed in her thoughts and accidentally made a mistake. Everyone looked at her intently. The Marquise looked at her in surprise and said that it seemed that a lesson in etiquette would need to be taught here. The young lady sighed heavily and said that they had already learned the basics of etiquette. The Marchioness asked in surprise who taught them. Haritico said that the Duchess taught them. The Marchioness sighed heavily and said that she understood everything, but Melissa had always been too soft with children. She looked closely at Eric and said that he was a good boy. He ate everything. She smiled and said that now he could go and see the gifts that she had prepared for him. The Marquise looked at the young lady intently and said that she would now call her Madame during their lessons, starting today. She looked at her intently and asked if she knew how to greet her properly. A moment later, the young lady showed all her manners and greeted Madame according to the rules of etiquette. The Madame froze in shock. Hari looked at her with a smirk and wondered if she was surprised because she was able to greet her like a true aristocrat. Unfortunately, in her past, she really was a rough country bumpkin. She smiled and told the Marquise that she would try to be a good student. She knew that in this world she was different now. In the past, she had learned a lot and had become a real lady. The Marquise told the young lady that since this was her first time learning ethics, they would start from the very basics, and she would have to repeat after her. The young lady sighed heavily, as she knew that she would have to button up all her clothes to the first button again. She thought that she had managed to make a good first impression. The Marchioness said that first of all, she would teach her the tea ceremony, and for this reason, she should watch her movements carefully. The young lady was surprised, because she knew very well that the tea ceremony was quite complicated. She wondered if they were teaching it without knowing the basics. She knew that the first thing they taught was such basic things as walking or sitting down. The Marquise smiled and told the young lady that now she should repeat the same. Hari sighed heavily. She knew she didn't have to worry about something like this. She had done this before and more than once. She looked at the Marquise with a smile, because she knew that even if she closed her eyes, she could do everything perfectly. The Marquise looked at her intently and told her to get up immediately and lifted her skirt. The Marquise looked at her intently and asked if she had not heard what she had just said. She looked at the girl intently and again told her to stand up and lift her skirt. Hari looked at her in bewilderment and asked if she had done something wrong. The Marquise looked at her intently and asked if she really thought she was going to punish her now for no reason. The Marchioness looked at the girl with cold fury and said that she hated it when she had to repeat the same thing several times, and she had to learn it too. The young lady looked at the Marquise in bewilderment, but did not answer. A moment later, she slowly stood up and walked over to the Marquise. The Marquise looked at the girl closely and told her to lift her skirt up like that, and a little higher. She knew that in the past, she had become so accustomed to the rods that it had begun to seem normal, but now, unfortunately, it was very painful for her. The Marquise said that if the young lady made a mistake again, she would be punished in the same way. After several attempts, the Marquise looked at the girl with fury and a grin and said that she should lift her skirt again. The Marquise looked at her in bewilderment and asked why she was not getting up. Hari looked intently at the Marquise and asked her to tell her what exactly her mistake was. The Marquise, with cold fury, looked at this girl and said that her every move was a complete failure. The young lady was amazed at the reason. Lisa said that she should have just exactly and everyone behind her, but could not even do this. She was furious, did not understand how much more the girl was going to disgrace Eugene. The young lady, in turn, sighed heavily and wondered if she should just give up and leave. The Marquise looked at her intently and said that the family situation was very difficult. She looked at the girl with a cold, menacing look and asked what she was going to do if her existence was going to interfere with her family. As the young lady stood up, she asked the Marquise to punish her and also point out the part she did wrong. The Marquise said that the angle of her wrist was wrong when she poured the tea. She said that she needed to practice more. The young lady looked at Eugene with excitement and asked why he didn't come back if he was already better. Eugene said that he was busy, so he didn't have time to babysit his brother anymore, and especially his brother said that he wanted to stay at the Earl's estate for a while. He looked at her closely and said that his aunt had told him that she could barely cope with them. So that was good. He looked intently at the butler and told him to come into my office now. She looked at him intently and said that he was saying such things as if his brother was annoying him, so he decided to dump him on the count. Eugene was shocked. He shouted at the young lady that everything was not like that at all. She looked at him intently and said that she knew it, but if he continued to say so, he might be misunderstood. Eugene sighed heavily and a moment later told the butler that they were done for the day. Eugene sighed heavily and informed the young lady that his brother did not want to return home. And his uncle said that Cavell had been too shocked by what had happened on the hunt, and that certain difficulties had arisen because of it. For this reason, he did not want to come to the summons, where everyone reminded him of the weather parents. She looked at him intently and said that this was what he thought. She asked if he would like to meet his brother and talk to him in person. Eugene sighed heavily and said that he was just planning to go there next week. He said that it would be very late, so he thought he could take them there too. She looked at him closely and said reassuringly that they were fine, so he should be careful. Eugene looked at the young lady with a soft smile on his face, as it meant a lot to him that she was reassuring him. He looked at her closely and asked if her aunt was treating her well. The young lady sighed heavily, but a moment later, with a radiant smile, said that everything was fine and he had nothing to worry about. The Marquise looked at the young lady intently and said that the fact that she had not learned anything yet made her think that she was not really trying. Hari looked at the Marquise with cold fury. She sighed heavily, knowing that she only had to endure this for Eugene's sake. She knew that the young man was very busy, so she did not want to tire him out even more. The young lady sat down on the chair slowly. It was very painful for her to sit. A moment later, she contacted the young man and greeted him. Louise said with a smile that she wanted to talk to her too. Louise asked the young lady how she was doing, and if she was okay. Harry smiled and said that she was okay. They chatted casually about nothing for a while. Johannes told the young lady that he thought it was too early for her to have a tutor, and she in turn thought the same. She understood perfectly well that at the Marquise, she behaved well only with Eric, so that he would begin to adore her and trust her. She understood that even if it seemed wrong, she could not do anything about it. The young lady, in turn, was well aware that the world was not fair. She sighed heavily and said that she was trying her best to learn what was not taught. The young man said that she did not need to try so hard. He said that she did not need to try so hard if she was very tired. The young lady sighed heavily and thanked him for such words. She sighed heavily and yawned, as unfortunately she couldn't sleep because of this. Visiting the mansion as if she was coming and going from work, so the only one who knew that Eric still cried every night was her. And late at night, when he stopped crying, he wandered around the house. She looked closely at the young man, because she saw that he was walking with the rabbit that she had given him. She knew that earlier he had said that he did not like it and wanted to throw it away. A moment later, the young lady approached the cute little dog and calmed it down so that it would not bark and frighten its owner. Previously, she thought that he stopped in front of the spouse's bedroom because he missed them very much. In his past life, he slept with his hands and feet tied because of his sleepwalking. She heard him ask for it himself because he was ashamed of his illness. She sighed heavily and asked him to go back to my room, as she wanted to sleep too. She was confused and didn't understand why she was sent back in time. She wondered if anyone wanted her to go through this again. She was confused because she didn't know why she was so worried about the boys. She knew that even if she could just leave home, it would be over. Although her body was still aching mentally, she was already an adult, so she could survive. When Eugene left her in the middle of the street, and also at the funeral, she wanted to leave the family. But even now, she still watched her brother as he wandered quietly around the mansion. A few minutes later, he turned around and walked into his room. She smiled and wished him good night. The Marquise looked at the young man in surprise and said that she thought he would stay at the Count's estate for some time. He looked at her intently and greeted her. Eric slowly walked up to his brother and greeted him. Hari looked at the young man intently. She didn't understand why he was so unenergetic. The young man, in turn, looked around nervously. The Marchioness looked at him intently and informed him that Eugene was not there, and also said that he was behaving like a child, and that this was too much. The Marquise said that she was sure he didn't come to me because he didn't want to see him. Hari was shocked because she didn't expect to hear something like that. She looked at the Marquise intently and said that, of course, it was not so, because Eugene was the one who was most looking forward to his brother's return. She looked at the Marquise intently and said that although he was busy, he said that he would put off all urgent matters for today and try to return home early. The Marquise looked at the young lady with irritation, but did not answer. Hari told the Marquise that as far as she remembered, he had told her about it. In the morning, she asked the Marquise if she had forgotten. The Marquise looked at the young man closely and said that he was probably very tired after a long journey. The young lady was surprised, as she saw that the Marquise was simply ignoring her. The Marquise hugged the young man, and leaving, said that he needed to rest. The young lady looked closely after the Marquise, as she understood that this all looked very strange. Eric looked at his aunt and said that he would like to beat his brother. The Marquise said that he could not, because his brother needed to rest after a long journey. She asked the young man if he really wanted to tire his brother even more. Hari slowly approached the young man and called him. She sighed heavily, as she really wanted to tell him something. She looked at him with a gentle smile and greeted him. He froze in place in surprise. But a moment later, with the speed of lightning, he simply ran away from her. She was surprised and did not understand why he behaved like that. At some point, this upset her very much. Some time later, Eugene returned home, and looking at everyone present, asked where his brother was. The butler informed him that his brother was now upstairs. A moment later, he looked up and saw his brother on the porch. He greeted him with a smile. The young man turned around with lightning speed and ran to his room. Eugene was shocked. He shouted, "Hey!" called his brother, but it was all in vain. The butler told the Duke that he would bring him back. The young man sighed heavily and said that there was no need for that. He said that it seemed that his brother was very tired, and they should let him rest. The young lady sighed heavily as she realized that she was truly unlucky. A moment later, she came into the room looking for her brother. She was a little irritated as she didn't understand where he was and wanted him to come out quickly so they could talk. A moment later, the young man shouted that she should leave quickly. She sighed heavily as she realized where he was hiding. The young man irritably shouted at her that she should leave. She sighed heavily and said that he could simply ignore her and just continue crying. Cavell shouted with permission in his voice that he was not crying at all. She sighed heavily and said that she knew perfectly well that he was not crying at all. He sighed heavily and said that he really wasn't crying. Hari understood that. Of course, this wasn't true. And it wasn't him who was sniffling behind her back. She told her brother that tears were nothing to be ashamed of, and what was really stupid was that he couldn't cry when he needed to. As he poured out tears, he told her that he still wouldn't cry. The Marquise looked at the young lady intently and informed her that today it would teach her how to walk properly, and if she dropped the book, she would be punished accordingly. The young lady knew that this was ridiculous, and no matter how well it did everything, it would still beat her. Harry in turn wondered if the Marquise really thought that she would just tolerate this. She looked sideways at the Marquise with a smirk, since she had no intention of doing this at all. A moment later, the young lady accidentally fell, and the table fell. The Marquise froze in shock. A moment later, she jumped up from her chair and angrily asked the girl what she had done. Hari was taken aback and asked the Marquise for forgiveness. She said that she had hurt her ankle and accidentally touched it. She was taken aback when she noticed that the Marquise's outfit was ruined. Haris reached out to the Marquise with lightning speed as she wanted to wipe her dress. She was taken aback and said that she had not even noticed that her hands were smeared with chocolate. The young lady shouted that they could wash away all the stains with water. The Marquise was taken aback and shouted to the girl, but she had already managed to pour a whole vase of water on her. The young lady slowly approached the Marquise and said in a hurry that she thought all the stains would come off if they rubbed well now. The Marquise was shocked. She shouted at the young lady to stop. She was furious because the dress was very expensive. The young lady was taken aback and asked her aunt for forgiveness. Moments later, the Marquise left the young lady. Hari looked at the maid and said that she was really sorry, and for that reason, she wanted to help her. The maid sighed heavily and said that she might get scolded if the young lady helped her. She was surprised, looked at the maid, and asked if she was afraid of getting a scolding from her aunt. The maid sighed heavily and said that Madame had always been strict with them. Hari looked closely at the maid and said that it seemed like she was sent by the Marquise. Now she understood why the new maids had such a close relationship. The maid sighed heavily and said that now she was done with cleaning and she had to go. She smiled and told the maid that they could play somewhere. The young lady had a task, because she understood that she ignored her, even though she called her sister. She understood that Estate has many servants who were selected by the Marquise. She was sure that the Marquise would change all the people in the house if she wanted, but she did not understand what the Marquise was planning. Eugene looked at the man intently and said that he was against it, and his relatives would stay in the estate. The man looked at him in bewilderment and told him not to be so stubborn. Eugene asked in surprise if it was normal for family members to live separately. The man told the young man that it must be difficult for him to cope with everything alone, and he believed that it would be difficult for him to manage alone. He looked at his uncle intently and said he was sure he had given him the same answer earlier. He looked at him intently and said that he had made his position clear and there would be no discussion. He looked at his uncle intently and said that he was the new duke of the family that had every right to the dukedom, not his nephew. Eugene told his uncle not to forget that the little boy he took care of no longer existed. The young lady was agitated because she saw that the young man was avoiding his brother in every possible way. She heard that Eugene was asking his brother to talk. The young man sighed heavily and said that, unfortunately, he had nothing to say. Eugene was surprised. He shouted that he had something to say. Cavell, without looking at his brother, said that he did not want to listen to him. He looked intently at his brother and said that he did not want to talk to him. Eugene was in shock and shouted at his brother not to do that to him. Cavell froze for a moment and looked at his brother with a dumbfounded expression, but a moment later he pushed his brother away and ran away from him. The Marquise looked at the young people closely as she saw that they were quarreling. She said with a smirk that quarreling was normal as they grew up. The young lady looked at the Marquise closely. She wondered if it was her imagination or if she was actually enjoying the process. The Marquise looked at her nephew intently and said that he should forget about his brothers and return with his aunt to the room. Eric said that he would go to his brothers. The Marquise, in turn, looked at him with bewilderment and cold fury. He looked at the young lady intently and asked where they had gone. She looked at him worriedly and said that she would go with him. Eric looked at her irritably and said that there was no one here, and also asked if she was sure that they went here. She said that she was sure, but apparently they went somewhere else. Eric looked at her intently and said that he would go the other way and she should look around here. Hari looked at him worriedly and asked if everything would be okay with him, because his body was still very weak and she was worried that he might suddenly lose consciousness. He told her to close her mouth, and he would not lose consciousness. A moment later, she decided to look where her brother went, but a few seconds later, she bumped into her brother. He looked at her in surprise because he did not understand why she came to him and how she found him at all. He looked at her intently and fearfully, said that she should not call her brother Eugene. Hari looked at him in surprise and asked why he was avoiding his brother. Cavell sighed heavily and said that his brother would be very angry because he had selfishly returned home. She looked at him in surprise and asked if brother Eugene would be angry because he was at home. The young lady slowly approached him and asked him if he had not returned home because Eugene had sent him a letter. He looked at her in surprise and asked what letter she was talking about, since he had not received anything. The young lady thought for a moment, as she had heard that he had refused to meet the young man when he was at the Earl's estate, and for that reason, instead of meeting, he often sent a letter to his brother. He said that he came here as he wanted, but he knew that his brother would not like it, that he still selfishly decided to return home. She was surprised, looked at him with bewilderment, and asked why he decided that brother Eugene was against his staying here. Cavell shouted that it was all because his brother hated him. Young Lydia, in turn, froze in shock, as she did not expect to hear anything like that. She was surprised, looked at him and asked what nonsense. He said she didn't understand why he suddenly assumed that Eugene hated him. He shouted that it was all because he was the only one who survived, and he is still alive because his parents protected him by shielding him with themselves. He said that at that moment he was so scared that he just kept silent, remained in their arms, and if they had been brave enough to call for help, then maybe someone would have come and saved them. But he continued to keep silent, afraid that those people might come back. He said that he kept silent like the last coward. Cavell sighed heavily and said with tears in his eyes that he wanted to go home very much. The young lady, in turn, froze in surprise and sat motionless. She did not know what to say to him. He was puzzled and told his friend that he was simply afraid that he would be asked why he came back. Hari looked at him intently and said that it was not so. Eugene slowly approached them and asked who it was. The young people were taken aback and looked intently in his direction. Eugene walked up to his brother like lightning and asked who had told him such nonsense. He quickly walked up to his brother and grabbed him by the shoulders, asking with rage who had told him such a thing. Cavell shouted at his brother to let him go immediately. A moment later, Eugene couldn't take it anymore and shouted at his brother that he was a complete idiot. Cavell froze in surprise, as he didn't expect to hear something like that. Cavell fell to the ground with a thud and shock. Eugene was furious. He screamed at his brother and said that no one in this house blamed him for what happened, and no one would blame him for coming back alive. He was furious, and he didn't understand how his brother couldn't know this. Cavell looked away from his brother and asked if he didn't hate him. Eugene looked at his brother intently and asked if he would be the only one to return. Would he be angry? Cavell shook his head with lightning speed and said that he would not be angry at all. Eugene looked at his brother closely and told him to listen to him carefully. He said that they were really very happy to have him back, and he was also sincerely glad that he could see him. Eugene looked at his brother with a gentle smile and thanked him for returning safe and sound. The young man froze for a moment with tears in his eyes. He was glad of his brother's words. A moment later, he began to cry. The young lady looked at them intently and sighed heavily. She was glad that everything was resolved. Hari looked at the young man closely and asked him if he wanted to go and see his brother. He sighed heavily and looked away from her. A moment later, he said that he would go and meet someone later. Eric was puzzled. He said that his brothers would sort it out themselves, so he didn't need to interfere. She looked at him intently, but didn't answer. A moment later, she walked up to the dog and, smiling, treated him to some treats. Harry noticed that he was very calm and didn't even react to her feeding the dog. She thought that around this time in her past life, he began to slowly open up to her. He looked at her with cold fury and told her to stop looking at him like that. The young lady sighed heavily as she realized that in this life, everything would be different. The young lady was puzzled. For every night, she wandered sleepily through the house. But a moment later, running down the steps, she was taken aback as she saw her brother Eugene. She was puzzled and wondered how long he had been there. She looked closely at her brother, as she saw that he was standing motionless, as if time had stopped for him. She saw that he looked very lonely and empty. She sighed heavily and simply stared after him, as unfortunately she couldn't say anything to him. All she could do was imprint this picture deep in her heart for as long as possible. Later, after the family met with other relatives, Eugene returned home with a wound on his leg after being thrown by a horse. Eugene looked closely at his brothers and asked them to stop crying. The young men told their brother that he was not at all well. He smiled softly and said that he was lucky to have escaped with only this wound. The young people looked at each other in bewilderment. The young lady asked with cold fury what the hell the adults were doing. She was furious and screamed that there were so many people there. Hari just couldn't sit still and watch such a scene. She looked at him with cold fury and asked what they had all been doing while he was in danger. He sighed heavily and looked closely at his leg, but a moment later said that he didn't even know what they were doing. He said with a smirk on his face that they were probably busy discussing how I could make him give in faster. He said he thought he needed to work hard so he could grow up faster. He sighed heavily and said that deep down he knew that he was just a child who knew nothing about the world. The young lady looked at him intently. She was shocked by his words. He sighed heavily and said with fury in his voice that this was the first time he felt so helpless. A whole autumn had already passed, but Madame still got to her. Madame looked at the young lady with a smirk and said that her behavior and manners proved that she did not have a worthy origin. She could not even refute the fact that the family was ridiculed because of her. She mockingly pitied the poor Duke, for he would never again be able to use his right leg as before. The young lady was furious, for she knew that her brother would soon be able to walk. The Marchioness, with a grin, said that she would be able to replace him in public with another relative, or after some time, Eugene could hand over power to his brother. Hari was furious and did not want to listen to such things anymore. She looked at the Marquise intently and said that sometimes she spoke as if she had some rights in their house, but the only owner of all the rights in the estate was her brother Eugene. She did not understand why the Marquise continued to forget about this. She looked at the Marquise intently and said that they say that as people get older, they start to lose their memory and become insane. She sighed heavily and told the Marquis that it seemed that this was already happening to her. She looked at the Marquise intently and asked with a grin if this could be possible. The Marquise was furious, as she did not want to hear such a thing. The Marchioness looked at her with anger and asked what she had just said. She angrily told the young lady that she had been rude and vulgar. The young lady asked for forgiveness and said that she had said such words out of fear. The Marchioness angrily shouted that a similar girl was recovering from a blow with a cane. The Marchioness looked at the young lady with fury and said that she did not care that Eric behaved like that, but she was puzzled and did not understand where Cavell was. She did not understand how they could not say goodbye to her when she left the house. She glared at the young lady and wondered how Melissa had ever taught her children. Hari was shocked. She didn't understand why the Marquise was finding fault with Cavell today. She knew that her aunt usually didn't pay any attention to him at all. The Marchioness was furious. She said that one was a lame cripple, the second was a prankster, and the third was not half mine. And to top it all off, they had picked up a dirty bitch without a clan or tribe. She did not understand how the great family could fall so low. The young lady froze in place from her words. She was burning with anger. The young lady clenched her fists and asked the Marquise with anger how she dared to say such a thing. Eugene slowly approached his aunt and asked if she was already leaving. She looked at him in surprise, as she did not expect to see him. The Marquise looked at him intently and said that she was sure that it was still difficult for him to walk and that he did not need to exhaust himself to see her off. Eugene sighed heavily and said that everything was fine, and of course he would come down, because she was going home. She looked at the young man with a grin, but did not answer. A moment later, he said goodbye to her. The young lady walked closely after her brother late at night. She was surprised, because she did not understand how she survived the time before growing up. She knew that, if compared to her past life, it seemed to her that life was harder now. A moment later, she screamed as she saw her brother trip and fall. She ran up to him, alarmed, and asked how he had managed to fall if there was nothing in front of him. The young lady slowly lifted her brother. Hari sighed heavily and looked around and said that she should hope that he would not have a scar. Harry froze in surprise for a moment as he took her hand. She looked closely at her brother and quietly said that it was time for them to go back to bed to get some sleep. Returning, she froze in surprise because she saw Eugene. She was surprised because she did not understand why you are like this. It is late at night and he is not sleeping. Eugene looked at them in surprise and asked why they weren't sleeping. He froze for a moment and looked at his brother with bewilderment. He called his brother, but he, not seeing him, went into his room. He looked closely after his brother and quietly asked the young lady since when he had this kind of thing. She looked at him intently because she knew that he didn't want to hear words of comfort, but she knew that everything was fine, and his brother was holding up well. She knew that he had no one to lean on now, so he was hurting like never before, and his pain was building up in his heart. She quietly whispered to him that everything would be fine and everything would work out. The Marchioness looked closely at the young lady and asked her if she had any idea why she had called her here. The young lady sighed heavily and said that, unfortunately, she did not know this. The Marquise said with a grin that it was all true. A moment later, the Marquise looked at the girl intently and said that she was sending her to an orphanage. Hari froze in place in surprise, as she had not expected such a thing at all. The Marquise said with a satisfied smile that it was owned by an acquaintance of hers, so her life there would be quite comfortable, and it would be much better than wandering around the streets. The young lady, clenching her fists, looked at the marquise and asked what Brother Eugene said about this. The marquise looked at her with bewilderment, pretending to know what she was talking about. Hari told the marquise that she had no right at all to make such decisions in the family. The marquise looked at the young lady with fury and asked what if he agreed. Hari asked the marquise if the young man agreed. She said that it was expected. Hari looked at the marquise intently and said that she was lying, because her brother would never solve problems in such a way. Her family did not solve problems in such a primitive and tactless manner. Even though she was not related to the family, she knew perfectly well that the family would not have gone to such measures. She looked intently at the marquise and asked how it was that she knew her relative's family worse than her homeless girl. The marquise looked at her with fury and asked what she was talking about. She looked at Hari with a smirk and asked if this wasn't the family style. A moment later, the marquise grabbed the young lady by the hair in a fury. She was furious. She did not understand how the girl dared to act so arrogantly in front of her. She shouted that the girl trusted Eugene too much. That's why this nonsense came into her head. She looked at the girl with fury and asked her if she really thought he had enough power to protect her. She asked the girl if she really thought he would lift a finger if her lifeless body was carried out of the room. She asked if she really thought that the other brothers would be able to help her. The marquise looked at the young lady with a smirk and said that most likely she even thought that they accepted her as their real sister. Hari, in turn, froze in place and shuddered from such a question. She knew it was a pitiful sight, but she didn't have the confidence to object. Marky screamed with the girl's washcloth canceling that she was just a stupid substitute, so such a country bumpkin was no good. Once they had a taste of luxury, their hunger would only grow. Cavell slowly walked down and looked at Hari in surprise, still not understanding what she was doing there. He looked at her in surprise and said that he asked what was wrong. He noticed that she was not the same as usual. The young lady looked at him intently and offered him something to eat. She looked at him intently and said quietly that she wanted them to all eat together. He looked at her in surprise and said that there was no problem with that, and they could go and eat now. A moment later, the young lady grabbed his hand and led him towards her brother. She looked intently at Eric and offered him something to eat, but the young man, with lightning speed, flatly refused to go with them. She sighed heavily and said that he didn't have to be like that. He said that he had no appetite and they could eat themselves. She looked at the young man intently and asked why they liked being apart so much these days. She sighed heavily and said that it wasn't that hard to eat together, at least sometimes. She looked at her brother intently and said that she really didn't want to eat alone. She was in shock. She didn't understand why she dipped alone every single day. She didn't understand why no one wanted to be on her side. A moment later, she was gone like lightning, shouting as she left that she hated them. Hari didn't know if she was upset because of the feeling of being killed by their old quarrels. She remembered the times when she lived in Meltington. Then she could not afford a piece of bread because it was considered a luxury. When her mother was still alive, she was not so unhappy, but after her death, she had to eat even melted snow to survive. And the hardest thing to endure was not the hunger, but the mournful silence in her house. The oppressive silence literally suffocated her. At that time, no one cared about her. She understood perfectly well that not even a single soul would notice if she died. Sometimes she lay quietly alone in her cold room, and then she thought that she was already practically dead. But once she got to the estate, she began to forget about the comfortable, that nightmarish silence that enveloped her world, that feeling of loneliness that was killing her. For this reason, she simply continued to grow up. Despite the bullying from her brothers, she thought that they might still accept her. The young lady sighed heavily, for she knew that she had not been sure of this until now. Those cruel words spoken by the marquise had moved her to the depths of her soul, but she, unfortunately, did not have the courage to refute them. But she didn't want them to see her stupid expression when she cried. The truth was, she really wanted to be their real sister, but she could never tell them that. The young lady had not yet woken up when she felt the marquise pulling her by the hand. The marquise looked at her with fury and asked if it was not enough for her to torment her brother. So now she decided to take on Eugene. The Marquise pulled her out of the room in a rage and shouted at her to stop. She should have gotten rid of her earlier. The young lady blogged in shock and asked what the Marquise was doing. The Marquise looked at the young lady with cold fury and anger and said that she and Eugene would no longer interfere with the activists. Hari was shocked by what was happening and screamed at the Marquise to let her go. But a moment later, the Marquise struck the girl with fury, and she fell to the ground with a crash. The Marquise looked at the girl with cold fury and asked if she couldn't just walk calmly next to her. A moment later, servants ran out into the street, but they were not shocked, but they could do nothing. Cavell also came outside and asked in surprise what was going on. He looked at the young woman in surprise and asked if she was really feeling unwell. A moment later, he was taken aback as he saw the state she was in. He looked at his aunt with fury and asked if she had really hit her. The Marchioness was furious because she did not understand where his manners were. Cavell Sex asked his aunt with cold fury if she had really hit her. He was furious and did not understand how she dared to raise her hand against her. He shouted that she had no right to do so. The young man pushed his aunt away in anger. He was beside himself with rage. Cavell angrily asked his aunt why she did it. Hari froze for a moment in surprise. The Marquise was shocked and shouted at the boy to leave her alone. He shouted that she was a witch. A moment later, the butler grabbed the boy and began to hold him, Cavell kicking and screaming at him to let go, as he had to teach her a lesson. A moment later, Eugene approached them and asked in bewilderment who had let the stranger into the estate. The Marquise asked in surprise if he meant that she was an outsider. He asked if he really had to remind her where her place was. Eugene looked at the butler and asked since when they let just anyone into the estate. The butler asked the master for forgiveness. Eugene asked his aunt where her dignity had gone. He did not understand how she could stoop to such a low level. She looked at him with cold fury and asked what he had just said. Eugene said that she should have been more careful when she touched on everything. He looked at her with cold fury and said that she was more ridiculous than that, and now she looked very pitiful. He looked intently at the young lady and extended his hand to her. Eugene looked at his aunt with fury and said that she should apologize to the young lady immediately. The Marquise looked at him in surprise and asked what would happen if she did not do so. He looked at his aunt with cold fury and said that in that case, he would do everything to make her regret today. She looked at him with cold fury and asked if he was really behaving like this, just because of a girl who didn't have a drop of his own blood. She looked at the young lady intently and said that because she looked like their sister, he was falling asleep a lot. Eugene sighed heavily and said that he understood perfectly well that this was not his sister at all. He looked closely at the young lady and said that she was already a full-fledged member of the family. Eugene looked at his aunt with a cold gaze and said that it seemed that she still did not understand. He said that if she insulted her at the appearance, then she insulted the whole family, and he would not let it go unpunished. He looked at her closely and asked if she didn't know what this meant. Eugene said that she had put the young lady in danger. It would be seen as a direct threat to the family, including a threat to him. He said that she must pay for her actions. Madame turned around in anger and left, although she told her nephew that he would regret it. The young man looked intently at the young lady. He was puzzled because he saw that she had been beaten. He was furious and didn't understand why she allowed herself to be treated like that. He said that she should have called for help. Cavell looked at his brother with fury and shouted at him not to scold her, because it was their aunt who got mad and dragged her outside. A moment later, Eric woke up and went outside. He looked at the noise around him in surprise and froze. He was surprised because he was flying the young lady surrounded by his brothers. They looked at her intently and asked what hurt her. Eric looked at them in surprise and asked if Cavell had hit her again. Cavell, in turn, shouted that he had not hit her at all. Cavell looked at Hari intently and asked if she wanted him to beat his aunt. He shouted that he definitely had to beat her. Eugene looked at her intently and said that he didn't need to cry at all. Eugene said that he was not angry with her at all. He pushed her hard and asked for forgiveness. The young lady, bursting into tears, asked if she was really part of the family. Eugene looked closely at the young lady and said that naturally she was their sister.